Small towns. Population 2,000. Everyone knows everyone. But that's exactly the problem. What happens when your neighbor, your pastor, your doctor becomes your worst nightmare? I'm your host at Verified Fears, and tonight we're exposing 11 real horror stories that destroyed small communities across America. These aren't fiction. These are documented cases of murder, disappearances, and pure evil hiding behind friendly smiles and Sunday morning church services. From a pharmacist who poisoned his entire town to children who vanished into mining tunnels never to be seen again. These stories will prove that the most dangerous place in America isn't the big city. It's the place where everybody knows your name. If you're ready to discover what really happens when there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Verified Fears is about to take you on a journey you'll never forget. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never trust a small town again. Let's move to our first story. Centralia, Pennsylvania. A name that sends chills down the spine of anyone who knows its dark history. What started as a typical small American town of 2,800 residents in 1962 has become something far more sinister. A real-life horror story that continues to unfold 63 years later. This isn't a tale of ghosts or monsters, but something far worse. A town literally consumed by hell itself, where the ground burns beneath your feet and the very air you breathe can kill you. But that's just the beginning of Centralia's nightmare. It all began on May 27, 1962, when the Centralia Borough Council hired 5 volunteer firefighters to clean up the town dump before Memorial Day. The dump was located in an abandoned strip mine pit, and the standard practice was to burn the trash and extinguish the fire before it could spread. But this time, something went terribly wrong. The fire wasn't properly extinguished, and it spread into the labyrinth of coal mines that honeycomb the ground beneath Centralia. What the residents didn't know was that they had just lit a fuse to an underground powder keg that would burn for generations. At first, the signs were subtle. Residents noticed the ground felt warm in certain spots, even during the harsh Pennsylvania winters. Steam began rising from cracks in the pavement, creating an eerie fog that rolled through the streets like something out of a nightmare. The smell of sulfur hung heavy in the air, giving the town an otherworldly atmosphere that made visitors uncomfortable and residents increasingly paranoid. But the real horror was yet to come. By the 1970s, the underground fire had spread to cover hundreds of acres beneath the town. Trees began dying in perfect circles, as if some invisible force was draining the life from them. Gardens withered overnight, and pets started getting sick from toxic fumes seeping through the soil. Residents reported headaches, nausea, and breathing, problems that doctors couldn't explain. The ground became so hot in some areas that it melted the soles of shoes, and underground temperatures reached a staggering 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The true terror of Centralia revealed itself on Valentine's Day, 1981, when 12-year-old Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard. Without warning, the ground beneath his feet opened up, creating a sinkhole 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep. Todd grabbed onto a tree root as he fell, hanging over a chasm filled with toxic carbon monoxide gas that would have killed him within minutes. His cousin ran for help, and Todd was pulled to safety, but the incident sent shockwaves through the community. The fire wasn't just burning beneath their feet, it was actively trying to consume them. Government studies revealed the horrifying scope of the disaster. The fire was spreading at a rate of 50 feet per year in all directions, with no known method to extinguish it. The heat was so intense that it was creating new geological formations underground, literally reshaping the earth beneath the town. Carbon monoxide levels in some homes reached deadly concentrations, and residents were essentially living on top of a giant oven that could collapse at any moment. The federal government declared Centralia uninhabitable and began the largest residential relocation in American history. But here's where the story takes a truly disturbing turn. Some residents refused to leave. They couldn't accept that their homes, their memories, their entire lives were being consumed by an unstoppable force. As the government condemned houses and demolished them, a handful of stubborn residents remained, creating a ghost town with living inhabitants. These holdouts became increasingly isolated and, according to many accounts, increasingly strange. Visitors to modern-day Centralia report experiences that defy explanation. The most common are the sounds, screams that seem to come from deep underground, as if the earth itself is in agony. These aren't the normal sounds of shifting soil or escaping gas. Witnesses describe them as distinctly human, filled with pain and terror. Local paranormal investigators have recorded these sounds, and audio analysis suggests they occur at frequencies that shouldn't exist naturally. Some theorists believe the extreme heat and toxic gases have created acoustic phenomena that mimic human voices, while others think something far more sinister is at work. The visual horrors are equally disturbing. The famous Graffiti Highway, where Route 61 was abandoned due to the underground fire, has become a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers and horror enthusiasts. But beneath the colorful spray paint lies something truly unsettling. The asphalt is cracked and broken, with steam constantly rising through the fissures. In winter, these cracks glow with an orange light from the fires below, creating the illusion that hell itself is trying to break through to the surface. The temperature differential creates optical illusions that make the road appear to move and shift, as if it's alive. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from the few remaining residents. They describe nights when the ground glows so brightly that it illuminates their homes from below, casting everything in an eerie orange light. They talk about waking up to find their basements filled with toxic smoke, forcing them to sleep with gas masks nearby. One resident, who asked to remain anonymous, described hearing voices calling his name from beneath his floorboards, voices that seemed to know intimate details about his life and family history. The psychological toll on the remaining residents has been devastating. Cut off from normal community life, with their neighbors gone and their town literally disappearing around them, many have developed what psychologists call environmental trauma syndrome. They become obsessively protective of their remaining property, paranoid about government surveillance, and increasingly isolated from the outside world. Some have reported hallucinations and nightmares involving being pulled underground by unseen forces. Scientific studies have only added to the horror. Geologists estimate that the fire contains enough coal to burn for another 250 years, possibly longer. The toxic gases being released include carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and sulfur compounds that can cause brain damage, respiratory failure, and death. The ground temperature continues to rise, and new sinkholes appear without warning. Essentially, Centralia is slowly being consumed from within, and there's absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop it. The most chilling aspect of the Centralia story isn't the fire itself. It's how easily a normal American town was transformed into a living nightmare. In 1962, Centralia was indistinguishable from thousands of other small Pennsylvania communities. Children played in the streets, families gathered for church on Sundays, and life moved at the peaceful pace that defines small-town America. But one careless mistake, one improperly extinguished fire, turned their home into a literal hellscape that destroyed everything they knew and loved. Today, Centralia serves as a terrifying reminder of how quickly normal life can spiral into horror. The few remaining residents live in a constant state of fear, never knowing when the ground beneath them might give way or when toxic gases might seep into their homes. They're prisoners in their own community, trapped by their refusal to abandon the only life they've ever known, even as that life slowly kills them. The story of Centralia, Pennsylvania, proves that sometimes the most terrifying horror stories are the ones that are completely, undeniably real. There are no monsters to defeat, no mysteries to solve, no happy endings to hope for. There's only fire, smoke, and the slow, inevitable consumption of everything once held dear, and deep beneath the ground, that fire continues to burn, waiting patiently to claim whatever remains of the town that once dared to call itself home. Let's move to our second story. Hamelin, West Virginia, population 847. A town so small it barely appears on most maps. Nestled deep in the coal country where mountains cast long shadows and secrets run deeper than the mining shafts that once sustained the community. In 1967, this forgotten corner of Appalachia became the center of one of America's most baffling and terrifying missing persons cases. A mystery that remains unsolved nearly 60 years later and continues to haunt the few families who still call Hamelin home. The nightmare began on March 15, 1967, when 8-year-old Tommy Morrison vanished while walking home from school. Tommy was known throughout the small community as a responsible child who never strayed from his usual route along Miners Road. His mother, Helen Morrison, became worried when he didn't arrive home by 4 o'clock and organized a search party with neighbors and local authorities. What they discovered would be the first clue in a pattern so disturbing that it would eventually attract federal investigators and tear the community apart. Tommy's school books were found scattered along the road leading toward the old Beckley mine entrance, a massive opening carved into the mountainside that had been abandoned since the 1940s. The books formed an almost deliberate trail, as if Tommy had been dropping them one by one while being led away. His red lunchbox was discovered at the very mouth of the mine shaft, but there was no sign of Tommy himself. The mine entrance had been sealed with heavy iron grating years earlier, but investigators found that several bars had been bent outward, creating an opening just large enough for a small child to squeeze through. Local authorities mounted an extensive search of the mine tunnels using dogs, flashlights, and mining equipment borrowed from nearby operations. The Beckley mine was a labyrinth of tunnels that extended nearly 3 miles into the mountain, with vertical shafts dropping hundreds of feet into flooded chambers. After 72 hours of searching, they found no trace of Tommy Morrison. What they did find was far more disturbing. Evidence that someone had been living in the deepest sections of the mine for an extended period. Makeshift sleeping areas, canned food supplies, and most chillingly, children's clothing that didn't belong to Tommy. Before the community could fully process Tommy's disappearance, the pattern escalated. On April 3rd, 9-year-old Sarah Beth Collins vanished under nearly identical circumstances. She was last seen walking toward the mine entrance after telling her grandmother she heard children playing underground. Her pink sweater was found hanging from the mine grating like a flag of surrender. 2 weeks later, 6-year-old Marcus Webb disappeared, followed by 10-year-old Jennifer Hayes in May. Each child was last seen heading toward the Beckley mine. Each left behind personal belongings arranged in an almost ritualistic pattern near the entrance. The community was gripped by terror, unlike anything they had ever experienced. Parents began accompanying their children everywhere, and the local school implemented a buddy system where no child was ever allowed to walk alone. But the disappearances continued with horrifying regularity. In June, twins Bobby and Billy Patterson, age 7, vanished simultaneously while playing in their backyard, which bordered the mine property. Their identical toy trucks were found at the mine entrance, positioned side by side as if the boys had carefully placed them there before walking into the darkness. By July, federal investigators had joined the case, bringing sophisticated equipment and expertise that the local sheriff's department simply didn't possess. What they discovered in the mine system defied explanation and challenged everything they thought they knew about the case. Deep in the tunnels, nearly 2 miles from the entrance, they found an underground chamber that had been converted into what could only be described as a children's playroom. The space contained toys, games, books, and child-sized furniture, all arranged with meticulous care. Most disturbing of all, the walls were covered with children's drawings, hundreds of them, depicting life underground with stick figures holding hands in dark tunnels. The FBI's investigation revealed that the mine system was far more extensive than anyone had realized. Generations of mining had created a vast underground network that connected to natural cave systems extending throughout the mountain. Some tunnels were so deep that they remained unmapped, and water tables had shifted over the years, creating new passages and closing others. The deeper the investigators went, the more evidence they found of long-term habitation. Someone, or something, had been using these tunnels as a base of operations for years, possibly decades. The most chilling discovery came in August, when investigators, following a series of child-sized footprints in the mine's deepest accessible tunnel, heard something that stopped them cold: the sound of children laughing. The laughter echoed through the tunnels from somewhere far below, seeming to come from chambers that their equipment indicated were completely flooded. When they called out, the laughter stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Electronic recording equipment captured the sounds, and audio analysis confirmed that multiple children's voices were present, though the source remained impossible to locate. Local residents began reporting increasingly disturbing phenomena around the mine entrance. Night shift workers at nearby operations claimed they could hear children singing lullabies that drifted up from the mine shafts. The songs were always the same: traditional children's songs like Ring Around the Rosie and London Bridge, but performed in harmony by multiple voices and always ending abruptly at midnight. Security guards refused to patrol the mine area alone, reporting feelings of being watched and followed by unseen presences. The 7th child to disappear was 11-year-old David Chambers, who vanished on September 12th while helping his father check their hunting traps near the mine. David's father, Robert Chambers, was only 50 yards away when his son disappeared. Robert heard David call out, "I hear them singing, Dad," followed by the sound of running footsteps toward the mine entrance. By the time Robert reached the spot where his son had been standing, David was gone. His hunting knife was found embedded in a wooden post near the mine entrance, as if he had tried to mark his location before being taken. The investigation took a darker turn when federal agents discovered that Hamelin's missing children weren't the first. Records from the 1920s and 1940s documented similar disappearances in the area, always involving children between the ages of 6 and 12, always connected to the mine system. Local historians found references in 19th century newspapers to children who went to play with the mountain children and were never seen again. The pattern suggested that whatever was happening in Hamelin had been occurring for over a century. As autumn approached, the community was in a state of complete psychological breakdown. Families were moving away in droves, abandoning homes and businesses rather than risk losing their children to whatever lurked in the tunnels below. Those who remained lived in constant fear, keeping their children indoors after dark and installing multiple locks on their doors. The local pastor reported that church attendance had tripled, but the prayers were desperate, frightened pleas rather than traditional worship. The case reached its most terrifying climax on October 31st, Halloween night, when all 6 remaining children in Hamelin disappeared simultaneously. Every child between the ages of 6 and 12 vanished from their homes between the hours of midnight and dawn, despite being under constant parental supervision. Windows and doors remained locked from the inside, and there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. The only clue was a series of small, muddy footprints leading from each house directly toward the Beckley mine entrance. Parents and authorities converged on the mine at sunrise, and what they discovered there defied all rational explanation. The iron grating that had been damaged months earlier was now completely removed, and the mine entrance had been decorated with children's artwork and toys arranged in intricate patterns. Fresh drawings covered the walls near the entrance, all depicting children holding hands in a circle around a figure that appeared to be an adult, though the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that extended far too long. The final search of the mine system involved every available law enforcement officer, mining expert, and volunteer in the region. They descended into the deepest accessible tunnels with floodlights, communication equipment, and enough supplies for a week-long operation. What they found in the deepest chamber would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. The children's playroom had been expanded and decorated for what appeared to be a party. Tables were set with cake and ice cream, party hats were arranged in neat rows, and balloons floated near the ceiling. In the center of the room, 13 small chairs were arranged in a circle, each with a name tag corresponding to one of the missing children. But the children themselves were nowhere to be found. The chairs were empty, the cake was uneaten, and the only sound was the steady drip of water from somewhere deep in the mountain. As the search team prepared to leave, they heard it one final time. The sound of children singing "Happy Birthday" in perfect harmony, coming from tunnels so deep that they appeared on no map and seemed to extend beyond the reach of human exploration. The official investigation was quietly closed in December 1967, with all 13 disappearances classified as unknown circumstances. The mine entrance was permanently sealed with concrete and steel reinforcement, and warning signs were posted throughout the area. The few families who remained in Hamelin never spoke publicly about what happened, and most moved away within the following year. Today, Hamelin, West Virginia, is a ghost town in all but name. The population has dwindled to fewer than 30 residents, most of them elderly people who refuse to abandon their family homes. The sealed mine entrance remains a source of local terror, as residents report that on quiet nights they can still hear the faint sound of children's laughter echoing up from deep underground. Some claim that on the anniversary of each disappearance, they can hear individual children calling out their names, as if trying to communicate with the world they left behind. The case of Hamelin's vanishing children remains one of America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. 13 children simply vanished from a small community, leaving behind only questions, fear, and the terrible certainty that somewhere in the darkness below, something continues to wait for the next generation of children to answer its call. Essie. Let's move to our third story. Adams, Tennessee. A sleepy farming community where cotton fields stretch to the horizon and neighbors still wave from their front porches. But in 1817, this peaceful corner of Robertson County became ground zero for what many consider the most documented supernatural terror in American history. The Bell Witch haunting wasn't just another ghost story. It was a 4-year nightmare that tormented an entire family, terrorized a community, and created the first paranormal case in United States history to attract official government investigation. The horror began in the summer of 1817 when John Bell, a respected farmer and church elder, encountered something that would forever change his understanding of reality. While inspecting his cornfields one evening, Bell noticed a strange animal sitting between the rows, a creature that appeared to be part dog, part rabbit, with the head of a dog, but the body of a rabbit. When Bell shot at the creature, it vanished instantly, leaving no trace of blood or fur. That night, the Bell family heard the first sounds that would plague them for years to come. Rhythmic knocking on their log cabin walls that seemed to circle the house throughout the night. What started as mysterious knocking quickly escalated into full-scale supernatural warfare. The entity, which would later identify itself as Kate Batts, a local woman who had died years earlier after a bitter land dispute with John Bell, began demonstrating abilities that defied all natural law. The Bell family's covers were ripped from their beds in the middle of the night, leaving them shivering in the cold. Heavy furniture moved across rooms by itself, slamming into walls with such force that it left permanent dents in the wood. Stones materialized from thin air and pelted family members, always stopping just short of causing serious injury, as if the entity was toying with them. The Bell family consisted of John and Lucy Bell, along with their children, Jesse, John Geerchuk Drury, Benjamin, Joel, Richard Williams, and their daughter Elizabeth, known as Betsy. It was Betsy, then 13 years old, who bore the brunt of the entity's attention and fury. The witch seemed particularly fixated on tormenting the young girl, subjecting her to physical attacks that left visible marks on her body. Witnesses reported seeing Betsy's hair pulled by invisible hands, her face slapped by unseen forces, and her body thrown across rooms as if by a powerful adult. The attacks were so severe that Betsy would often be found unconscious, with bruises and scratches covering her arms and face. But the entity's power extended far beyond physical manifestations. Within months of the hauntings beginning, the Bell Witch began to speak, initially in whispers and gasps that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The voice gradually became stronger and more articulate, eventually developing into the clear, intelligent speech of an adult woman. The entity could hold conversations, answer questions, and demonstrate knowledge of events happening miles away from the Bell farm. It could predict the future with startling accuracy, and seemed to know the intimate secrets of everyone it encountered. The witch's knowledge was so extensive that it bordered on omniscience. It could recite verbatim conversations that had taken place in private homes throughout the county, repeat sermons given by preachers in distant churches, and describe the contents of letters before they were opened. When visitors came to investigate the haunting, the entity would greet them by name and recount details of their personal lives that it should have had no way of knowing. This supernatural intelligence made the Bell Witch far more terrifying than a simple poltergeist. It was as if the family was being stalked by an invisible enemy who could see and hear everything they did. Word of the Bell Witch spread throughout Tennessee and beyond, attracting visitors from across the South who came to witness the phenomena firsthand. The Bell home became a pilgrimage site for the curious, the faithful, and the skeptical alike. Every visitor left convinced that they had witnessed something genuinely supernatural. The entity seemed to enjoy the attention, often performing elaborate displays for guests, moving objects on command, or engaging in lengthy philosophical discussions about the nature of life and death. Among the most notable visitors was General Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States, who traveled from Nashville with a group of men specifically to investigate the Bell Witch. Jackson was a military hero known for his skepticism and practical nature. But even he was unprepared for what he encountered. According to witnesses, Jackson's wagon became mysteriously stuck as it approached the Bell property. despite the wheels being in perfect working order and the road being clear. The wagon would not budge until the Bell Witch's voice rang out, welcoming Old Hickory to her domain and allowing the party to proceed. During Jackson's visit, one of his men boasted that he was a witch tamer and could end the haunting immediately. The entity responded by slapping the man repeatedly with invisible hands, then sticking him with pins until he danced around the room in pain. The witch then told the man he would be ridden like a horse all night long, and witnesses reported seeing the man's body contorting and bucking as if he were being ridden by an invisible rider. Jackson and his party left the next morning, with the future president reportedly saying he would rather fight the British again than spend another night with the Bell Witch. The entity's cruelty toward John Bell became increasingly sadistic as the haunting progressed. It would follow him to church services, disrupting prayers and hymn singing with loud cursing and blasphemous remarks that could be heard throughout the congregation. During business meetings, the witch would embarrass Bell by revealing his private thoughts and intentions to everyone present. The constant psychological torture began to take a severe physical toll on the family patriarch. Bell developed a nervous condition that caused his tongue to swell, making speech difficult and sometimes impossible. The witch seemed to take particular pleasure in Bell's suffering, often taunting him about his deteriorating health and predicting his death with gleeful anticipation. Family members reported that the entity would whisper threats in Bell's ear throughout the night, promising to torment him until his dying day and beyond. The psychological warfare was so intense that Bell became increasingly withdrawn and paranoid, unable to trust his own perceptions or feel safe in his own home. As the haunting entered its 4th year, the entity's attacks on Betsy Bell intensified dramatically. The witch became obsessed with preventing Betsy's engagement to Joshua Gardner, a local young man whom Betsy loved deeply. The entity would physically attack Betsy whenever Joshua visited, leaving her covered in bruises and scratches that served as a constant reminder of the witch's power over her life. The attacks became so severe that Betsy eventually broke off her engagement, unable to subject Joshua to the supernatural terror that surrounded her. The Bell Witch's influence over Betsy extended beyond physical violence into psychological manipulation that bordered on demonic possession. Witnesses reported that Betsy would sometimes speak in voices that were not her own, reciting information she couldn't possibly have known, and displaying personality traits completely foreign to her natural character. During these episodes, Betsy seemed to lose all control over her actions, performing tasks and saying things that she had no memory of afterward. The haunting reached its horrific climax in December 1820, when John Bell's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. He had been bedridden for weeks, suffering from seizures and periods of unconsciousness that baffled local doctors. On the morning of December 19th, Bell was found in a coma so deep that family members could not wake him. Beside his bed, they discovered a small vial containing a dark, oily liquid that no one in the household had ever seen before. When John Bell Jr. showed the vial to other family members, the Bell Witch's voice filled the room with triumphant laughter. The entity gleefully announced that it had given old Jack a dose of my special medicine last night, which fixed him. To prove the liquid's lethal nature, John Jr. gave a few drops to the family cat. The animal immediately went into convulsions and died within minutes, confirming that Bell had been poisoned by supernatural means. John Bell died that evening, never regaining consciousness. At his funeral, the Bell Witch demonstrated the depths of its cruelty by singing drinking songs, making crude jokes during the burial service, disrupting the solemn ceremony with invisible laughter and commentary. The entity showed no remorse for its role in Bell's death, instead expressing satisfaction that its 4-year campaign of terror had achieved its ultimate goal. Following John Bell's death, the supernatural activity began to diminish gradually. The entity announced that it was satisfied with its revenge and would be leaving the Bell family in peace, though it promised to return in 7 years to torment future generations. True to its word, the Bell Witch returned briefly in 1828, manifesting primarily to John Bell Jr. and making predictions about the Civil War and other future events. The entity then announced it would return again in 1935. Though this final visitation was reportedly less dramatic than the original haunting. The Bell Witch case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented supernatural events in American history. Unlike most ghost stories, which rely on second-hand accounts and folklore, the Bell Witch haunting was witnessed by hundreds of people over 4 years, including prominent citizens, government officials, and religious leaders. Detailed records were kept by multiple family members and visitors, creating a comprehensive chronicle of supernatural events that has been studied by researchers for over 2 centuries. What makes the Bell Witch case particularly terrifying is its combination of intelligence, malevolence, and seemingly unlimited power. This wasn't a mindless spirit trapped in a house. It was a calculating entity capable of complex reasoning, long-term planning, and sophisticated psychological warfare. The witch demonstrated abilities that went far beyond traditional poltergeist activity, including omniscience, precognition, telekinesis, and the power to manipulate physical matter in ways that defied natural law. The legacy of the Bell Witch continues to haunt Adams, Tennessee, to this day. The Bell property has changed hands multiple times over the years, but supernatural activity continues to be reported by residents and visitors. The Bell Witch Cave, located on the original Bell property, has become a popular tourist destination where visitors report experiencing unexplained phenomena, including temperature drops, disembodied voices, and the sensation of being touched by invisible hands. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied the Bell Witch case consider it the gold standard for supernatural documentation. The combination of multiple credible witnesses, consistent testimony across different time periods, and physical evidence that was observed by skeptics and believers alike creates a compelling case for genuine supernatural activity. Whether one believes in the paranormal or not, the Bell Witch haunting remains a testament to the power of evil to completely destroy the lives of innocent people, proving that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot escape. Let's move to our 4th story. Blairstown, Iowa. Population 623. A community so quintessentially American that Norman Rockwell could have painted its main street. Tree-lined avenues, a white-steepled church, and neighbors who genuinely cared for one another's well-being. In 1916, this idyllic farming town became the hunting ground for one of America's most calculating killers, a man whose weapon of choice wasn't a gun or knife, but the very medicine people trusted to heal them. Dr. Robert George Rutledge didn't just betray the Hippocratic Oath. He turned it into a death sentence for 12 innocent souls. Dr. Rutledge arrived in Blairstown in the spring of 1914, a distinguished gentleman in his early 40s with impeccable credentials from the Chicago College of Medicine. The town had been without a resident physician for over a year, and Rutledge's arrival was celebrated as a godsend. He was everything the community could have hoped for in a doctor: articulate, well-educated, and possessed of a gentle bedside manner that put even the most anxious patients at ease. Within months of establishing his practice in a converted Victorian home on Main Street, Rutledge had become one of Blairstown's most respected citizens. What the residents of Blairstown couldn't have known was that their beloved doctor harbored a fascination with death that bordered on obsession. Rutledge had spent years studying toxicology, not to save lives, but to perfect methods of taking them. His medical journals, discovered after his arrest, revealed a mind consumed with the mechanics of murder. Page after page contained detailed notes on poison dosages, symptom progressions, and methods for masking homicidal intent behind the facade of natural death. He had come to Blairstown not to heal, but to create the perfect laboratory for his twisted experiments. The killing began in October 1914, though it would be nearly 2 years before anyone suspected that the deaths plaguing Blairstown weren't natural occurrences. Rutledge's first victim was elderly Mrs. Margaret Thornton, a widow who suffered from chronic arthritis. Rutledge had been treating her with what he claimed were new pain medications from Chicago, but were actually carefully calibrated doses of strychnine mixed with laudanum. Mrs. Thornton's death appeared to be from heart failure, a common occurrence for a woman of her age. The entire community mourned her passing, and Dr. Rutledge delivered a touching eulogy at her funeral, speaking eloquently about the privilege of easing her final days. The second victim was James Crawford, a 40-year-old blacksmith who had sought treatment for persistent headaches. Rutledge diagnosed him with a rare blood disorder and prescribed a series of iron supplements that were actually doses of arsenic carefully titrated to mimic the symptoms of anemia. Crawford's health deteriorated over several weeks, with Rutledge documenting each stage of poisoning in his private journal with the detached fascination of a scientist studying laboratory rats. When Crawford finally died, Rutledge attributed his death to the blood disorder and recommended that the family avoid autopsy due to the distressing nature of the condition. What made Rutledge's crimes particularly horrifying was his methodical approach to selecting victims. He chose people who were already suffering from ailments that could mask the symptoms of poisoning. Elderly patients with weak hearts, men with existing stomach problems, women with mysterious feminine complaints that Victorian medicine poorly understood. He would gain their trust over months of seemingly caring treatment, establishing himself as their savior before slowly introducing the very toxins that would kill them. The third and fourth victims were the Morrison brothers, farmers in their 60s who had developed respiratory problems from years of working around grain dust. Rutledge convinced them that their condition required a new treatment involving inhaled medications administered through a specially designed apparatus. The apparatus was actually delivering chlorine gas in carefully measured doses, slowly destroying their lung tissue while creating symptoms that perfectly mimic the progression of their existing respiratory disease. Both men died within days of each other, and the community attributed their deaths to the harsh winter and their demanding work. Rutledge's journals reveal the depth of his psychological pathology. He wrote extensively about the intellectual stimulation of watching his patients die, describing their symptoms with clinical detachment while expressing satisfaction at his ability to fool both families and colleagues. He saw himself as a superior being conducting valuable research, viewing his victims not as human beings, but as test subjects in his grand experiment. Most chillingly, he wrote about the trust his patients placed in him, describing their faith in his medical expertise as touching and useful. The doctor's confidence grew with each successful murder, leading him to take increasingly bold risks. His fifth victim was his own wife, Constance Rutledge, a gentlewoman who had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the high mortality rate among her husband's patients. Rutledge poisoned her with mercury over a period of 6 months, telling concerned neighbors that she was suffering from a nervous condition that required complete rest and isolation. Constance's death was attributed to complications from hysteria, a convenient diagnosis that explained away her neurological symptoms and behavioral changes. The murder of his wife marked a turning point in Rutledge's killing spree. Having eliminated the person most likely to suspect his activities, he felt free to accelerate his timeline. Over the following 6 months, he would claim 7 more victims, including 2 of his own children. 10-year-old Robert Jr. and 8-year-old Mary Rutledge died within weeks of each other, ostensibly from scarlet fever, though post-mortem examination would later reveal they had been systematically poisoned with digitalin, a heart medication that mimics the symptoms of the infectious disease. The killing of his own children revealed the true depths of Rutledge's psychopathy. His journal entries during this period show no remorse, only scientific curiosity about how the smaller body mass of children affected poison absorption rates. He wrote detailed observations about their symptoms, noting how their trust in their father allowed him to administer increasingly large doses without resistance. Most horrifically, he described their final moments with clinical precision, treating their deaths as valuable data points in his ongoing research. The community was devastated by the loss of the Rutledge children, rallying around the doctor with unprecedented support during his supposed time of grief. Church ladies organized meal deliveries, neighbors offered to help with household chores, and the entire town attended the double funeral. Rutledge played the role of grieving father perfectly, delivering a heartbreaking eulogy that left not a dry eye in the church. His performance was so convincing that several families specifically requested his medical services, believing that a man who had suffered such personal tragedy would be especially compassionate toward their own medical needs. The final victims were chosen with deliberate cruelty. Rutledge selected the families who had shown him the most kindness during his supposed bereavement, targeting children and parents who had brought flowers to his wife's grave or offered words of comfort during his darkest hours. 12-year-old Tommy Walsh died from what appeared to be appendicitis, but was actually severe internal bleeding caused by warfarin poisoning. His mother, Patricia Walsh, succumbed 3 weeks later to what Rutledge diagnosed as grief-induced heart failure, though toxicology would later reveal massive doses of digitalis in her system. The final victim was Benjamin Hayes, the town's mayor and one of Rutledge's closest friends. Hayes had been the driving force behind recruiting Rutledge to Blairstown and had personally guaranteed the doctor's character to skeptical residents. When Hayes began suffering from mysterious stomach ailments, Rutledge volunteered to treat him personally, administering what he claimed were experimental medications from European medical colleges. Hayes died in agony over the course of 2 weeks, with Rutledge at his bedside, carefully documenting each symptom while maintaining the facade of a concerned friend and physician. Rutledge's downfall came from an unexpected source, his own arrogance. After Hayes's death, the doctor made the mistake of discussing the case with a visiting physician from Des Moines, Dr. Harrison Polk, who had known Hayes personally. Rutledge's clinical description of Hayes's symptoms included details that could only have been observed through deliberate poisoning, particularly the progression of neurological damage that didn't match any known disease process. Dr. Polk quietly began his own investigation, reviewing death certificates and interviewing family members of Rutledge's deceased patients. The evidence Dr. Polk uncovered was overwhelming. Rutledge's patients had died at a rate nearly 10 times higher than the national average for rural physicians. Most had died from symptoms that closely matched various forms of poisoning, and several had reported unusual tastes in their medications shortly before their conditions worsened. Most damning of all was the discovery of Rutledge's private laboratory in his basement, containing an extensive collection of toxic substances and detailed notes on their effects when administered to humans. The arrest of Dr. Robert Rutledge on March 15, 1916, sent shockwaves through Blairstown that reverberated for generations. The man they had trusted with their lives, their children's lives, and their most intimate health concerns was revealed to be a monster who had methodically murdered 12 members of their community over 18 months. The betrayal was so profound that several residents suffered nervous breakdowns, unable to reconcile the caring physician they had known with the calculating killer he had always been. Rutledge's trial became a national sensation, attracting reporters from major newspapers across the country. The prosecution presented evidence that painted a picture of unprecedented medical betrayal, while Rutledge maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming that he was being persecuted for his advanced medical techniques. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all 12 counts of murder in the first degree. During his sentencing hearing, Rutledge finally revealed his true nature. Rather than expressing remorse for his crimes, he launched into a lengthy monologue about the scientific value of his research and his belief that he had contributed valuable knowledge to the field of toxicology. He showed no emotion when describing the deaths of his victims, including his own wife and children, referring to them only as subjects and case studies. The judge, visibly shaken by Rutledge's complete lack of humanity, sentenced him to death, describing him as a perversion of everything the medical profession represents. The impact on Blairstown was devastating and long-lasting. The community struggled to rebuild trust in medical professionals, and it took over a decade before another doctor was willing to establish a practice in the town. Many families left Blairstown entirely, unable to continue living in a place where they had been so thoroughly betrayed. Those who remained often spoke in hushed tones about neighbors and friends who had died trusting the man who was systematically murdering them. The Rutledge house was demolished within months of his execution. But the psychological scars he left on Blairstown proved impossible to erase. For years afterward, residents would gather at the site where his practice once stood, trying to understand how such evil could have hidden behind such a convincing facade of respectability. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the terrifying reality that monsters often wear the most human faces. Dr. Robert George Rutledge was executed by hanging on October 13, 1916, taking with him the secrets of how many more victims he might have claimed if his arrogance hadn't finally exposed his crimes. His case remains one of the most chilling examples of medical murder in American history, proving that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones most capable of destroying us. In Blairstown, Iowa, the memory of Dr. Rutledge serves as an eternal reminder that evil can hide behind any face, wear any uniform, and exploit any trust, even the sacred bond between doctor and patient. So, let's move to our fifth story. Antelope, Oregon. Population 40. A forgotten speck on the map of eastern Oregon where jackrabbits outnumbered residents and the closest neighbor might be miles away across the high desert. In 1981, this isolated ranching community became the epicenter of the largest bioterrorism attack in United States history. Orchestrated not by foreign enemies or domestic terrorists, but by a religious cult that turned an entire town into their personal laboratory for biological warfare. The Rajneesh cult's 4-year occupation of Antelope didn't just change the demographics of a small town. It revealed how easily American communities could be infiltrated, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed by those willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. The nightmare began in July 1981, when representatives of the Rajneesh Foundation International purchased the 64,000-acre Big Muddy Ranch for $5.8 million, claiming they intended to establish a small agricultural commune. The ranch was located 12 miles from Antelope, far enough from the town to avoid immediate scrutiny, but close enough to impact local politics and resources. What the residents of Antelope didn't know was that they had just become unwilling neighbors to one of the most dangerous religious movements in American history, led by a charismatic guru whose followers would stop at nothing to create their vision of a perfect society. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, born Chandra Mohan Jain in India, had built a worldwide following by combining Eastern spirituality with Western materialism and sexual liberation. His movement attracted thousands of educated, affluent followers who were willing to donate their life savings to support his vision. But beneath the veneer of spiritual enlightenment lay an organization structured like a totalitarian state, complete with its own intelligence network, armed security force, and leadership willing to use violence and intimidation to eliminate opposition. The transformation of the Big Muddy Ranch into Rajneeshpuram happened with startling speed and military precision. Within months, the cult had constructed a small city complete with its own airport, shopping centers, restaurants, and residential complexes housing over 7,000 residents. The construction was funded by the life savings of followers who had sold their homes and businesses to join the movement, creating a financial empire worth an estimated $120 million. But more disturbing than the rapid development was the cult's systematic infiltration of local government and their growing hostility toward anyone who questioned their activities. The residents of Antelope watched in horror as their quiet community was invaded by red-clad followers who began appearing at town meetings, city council sessions, and local businesses with increasing frequency. The Rajneeshis, as they became known, were polite but persistent in their efforts to influence local politics, and it soon became clear that their ultimate goal was complete control of the region. They began purchasing property throughout Antelope, forcing longtime residents to sell their homes and businesses through a combination of economic pressure and psychological intimidation. The cult's takeover strategy became apparent in 1982 when they attempted to incorporate Rajneeshpuram as an official city, complete with its own municipal government and law enforcement. When Oregon state officials challenged the legality of the incorporation, citing constitutional separation of church and state, the Rajneeshis responded with a campaign of legal warfare that tied up the courts for years. Meanwhile, they continued consolidating power in Antelope, eventually gaining control of the city council and mayor's office through a combination of voter intimidation and demographic manipulation. Ma Anand Sheela, Rajneesh's personal secretary and the de facto leader of the cult's operations, emerged as the most ruthless and dangerous figure in the organization. Sheela wielded absolute power over the daily operations of Rajneeshpuram and showed no hesitation in using violence and criminal activity to advance the cult's interests. Under her leadership, the Rajneeshis established what amounted to a private army, complete with automatic weapons, armored vehicles, and a sophisticated surveillance network that monitored both cult members and local residents. The first signs of the cult's willingness to use biological warfare came in 1984, when several restaurants in the Dalles, Oregon, experienced mysterious outbreaks of food poisoning. The incidents were initially attributed to poor food handling, but the pattern of contamination was too systematic to be accidental. Health officials eventually determined that someone had deliberately contaminated salad bars with salmonella bacteria, but they couldn't identify the perpetrator or determine the motive behind the attacks. The truth behind the salmonella attacks wouldn't be revealed until years later, when former cult members testified that the contamination was a test run for a much larger bioterrorism campaign designed to influence the outcome of local elections. The Rajneeshis had established a sophisticated biological laboratory within their compound, complete with equipment and expertise necessary to cultivate dangerous pathogens. Under Sheela's direction, cult scientists had grown large quantities of salmonella bacteria, specifically for use as a weapon against the local population. The 1984 election represented the culmination of the cult's efforts to seize political control of Wasco County, which included both Antelope and the Dalles. The Rajneeshis had registered thousands of their members to vote, potentially giving them enough electoral power to control local government and law enforcement. However, they faced significant opposition from longtime residents who had organized to prevent the cult takeover. Sheila's solution was characteristically ruthless. If they couldn't win the election legitimately, they would prevent their opponents from voting by making them too sick to reach the polling stations. The biological attack began on September 9, 1984, when cult members systematically contaminated salad bars at 10 restaurants throughout the Dalles. The perpetrators, working in teams of 2 or 3, would enter restaurants during busy lunch periods and pour liquid cultures of salmonella bacteria directly onto food items, particularly lettuce, tomatoes, and other raw vegetables. The attacks were coordinated to maximize exposure while minimizing the chances of detection, with cult members leaving immediately after contaminating the food. The results of the bioterrorism campaign exceeded even Sheila's expectations in terms of casualties and community impact. Within days of the contamination, hundreds of people throughout the Dalles began experiencing severe symptoms of food poisoning, including violent diarrhea, vomiting, fever, and dehydration. Local hospitals were overwhelmed with patients, and medical staff struggled to understand why so many people were simultaneously experiencing identical symptoms. The outbreak eventually affected 751 people, making it the largest bacterial contamination incident in modern American history. The psychological impact on the community was even more devastating than the physical suffering. Residents of the Dalles and surrounding areas lived in constant fear that their food supply had been permanently compromised. Restaurant patronage plummeted, local businesses suffered massive financial losses, and many families stopped eating out entirely for months after the attacks. The contamination created a climate of paranoia and suspicion that tore at the fabric of the community, with neighbors questioning each other's loyalty and everyone looking over their shoulders for potential threats. What made the biological attacks particularly terrifying was their randomness and invisibility. Unlike conventional terrorism, which typically targets specific individuals or symbolic locations, the salmonella contamination struck ordinary people going about their daily lives. Families celebrating birthdays at local restaurants, business people grabbing quick lunches, elderly couples enjoying dinner out. All became victims of an attack they never saw coming and couldn't defend against. The arbitrary nature of the targeting created a sense of helplessness that conventional security measures couldn't address. The investigation into the outbreak initially focused on natural causes, with health officials examining everything from water supplies to food distribution networks. The possibility of deliberate contamination was considered, but seemed too far-fetched to warrant serious investigation. The Rajneeshis actually volunteered to help with the investigation, offering medical expertise and laboratory facilities while secretly destroying evidence of their involvement. Their cooperation was so convincing that they were initially considered victims rather than perpetrators of the attack. The cult's biological warfare program extended far beyond the salmonella attacks. Former members later revealed that Sheila had ordered the development of more deadly pathogens, including typhoid and AIDS cultures, for potential use against specific targets. The cult's laboratory had been attempting to cultivate HIV specifically for use against government officials and local leaders who opposed their activities. Plans were discovered for contaminating water supplies, air conditioning systems, and even the food served at county government buildings. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of the cult's assassination list, which included the names of United States Attorney Charles Turner, Oregon Attorney General David Frohnmeyer, and several local officials who had opposed the cult's incorporation efforts. The biological weapons program was intended to provide untraceable methods for eliminating these targets, with plans ranging from contaminated food delivery to aerosol dispersal of pathogens in government buildings. Only the internal power struggle that eventually destroyed the cult prevented these assassination attempts from being carried out. The collapse of Rajneeshpuram came suddenly in 1985, when Bhagwan Rajneesh himself turned against Sheila and her inner circle, publicly accusing them of criminal activity and attempting to distance himself from their actions. Sheila and several top lieutenants fled to Europe, where they were eventually arrested and extradited to face charges in the United States. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of the cult's criminal enterprise, including illegal wiretapping, immigration fraud, attempted murder, and of course, the bioterrorism attacks that had terrorized the region for over a year. The trial of Ma Anand Sheila and her co-conspirators provided the first detailed look at how the bioterrorism campaign had been planned and executed. Evidence presented in court included laboratory equipment used to cultivate salmonella, detailed plans for future biological attacks, and testimony from former cult members who had participated in the contamination. Sheila was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, though she served only 29 months before being released and deported to Switzerland. The residents of Antelope faced the monumental task of rebuilding their community after the cult's departure. The Rajneeshis had systematically dismantled the town's infrastructure, selling off municipal equipment and leaving behind a landscape of abandoned buildings and contaminated property. Many longtime residents had been forced to relocate during the cult's occupation, and convincing them to return required years of effort and significant financial investment from state and federal agencies. The psychological scars left by the Rajneesh occupation proved more difficult to heal than the physical damage. Residents who had lived through the 4-year nightmare suffered from what psychologists now recognize as community-wide post-traumatic stress disorder. The betrayal of trust represented by the bioterrorism attacks created lasting paranoia about food safety, government protection, and the possibility of future attacks. Many families left the region permanently, unable to feel safe in a place where they had been deliberately targeted for biological warfare. The legacy of Rajneeshpuram extends far beyond the borders of rural Oregon. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting bioterrorism and highlighted critical vulnerabilities in America's food safety infrastructure. Federal agencies used lessons learned from the Rajneesh investigation to develop new protocols for detecting and responding to biological attacks, protocols that would prove essential in later terrorism investigations. More broadly, the Rajneesh case demonstrated how easily small American communities could be overwhelmed by well-funded organizations with criminal intent. The cult's success in infiltrating local government, intimidating residents, and carrying out sustained attacks revealed gaps in law enforcement coordination and community preparedness that persist to this day. The fact that a foreign religious leader could establish what amounted to a private army on American soil, complete with biological weapons capabilities, raised fundamental questions about immigration policies and religious freedom protections. The abandoned buildings of Rajneeshpuram still dot the Oregon landscape, serving as concrete reminders of how quickly a peaceful community can be transformed into a battleground. Local residents continue to find evidence of the cult's activities. Buried weapons caches, laboratory equipment, and surveillance devices, decades after their departure. These discoveries serve as ongoing reminders that the threat posed by the Rajneeshis wasn't limited to the attacks they successfully carried out, but extended to the far more deadly capabilities they were developing when their organization finally collapsed. The story of Antelope, Oregon, stands as one of America's most chilling examples of domestic terrorism, proving that the greatest threats to small-town America often come not from foreign enemies, but from those who exploit our freedoms to destroy the very communities that welcomed them. In a place where neighbors once left their doors unlocked and children played safely in the streets, the legacy of biological warfare continues to cast a shadow over daily life. serving as an eternal reminder that evil can take root anywhere, even in the most isolated corners of our nation. Let's move to our sixth story, Galloway, Scotland. The rugged southwestern coast, where ancient cliffs rise from churning gray waters and mist clings to the landscape like a burial shroud. In the early 1400s, this remote wilderness became home to what historians consider the most savage family in recorded human history. A clan of cannibals who turned the act of survival into an art form of pure evil. For 25 years, the Bean family operated from sea caves, carved by millennia of tides, creating a self-sustaining community built entirely on human flesh and the systematic murder of anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. Alexander Bean, known to locals as Sawney Bean, was born into poverty in East Lothian during the late 14th century. Historical records describe him as a man of enormous physical strength but limited intelligence, someone who showed early signs of the antisocial behavior that would eventually define his legacy. Rather than pursuing honest work like his father, a ditch digger and hedge trimmer, Bean chose a life of petty crime and vagrancy. His transformation from common criminal to legendary monster began when he met and married Black Agnes Douglas, a woman whose reputation for cruelty and violence matched his own bloodthirsty nature. The couple's descent into ultimate evil began as a practical response to their circumstances. Cast out from civilized society for their criminal behavior, Bean and Agnes found themselves homeless and starving on the desolate Galloway coast. Traditional sources of food were scarce in the harsh landscape, and their lack of skills made farming or fishing impossible. The first murder was likely born of desperation. A lone traveler attacked for his purse and provisions. But when hunger drove them to consume their victim's flesh, Bean and Agnes discovered that cannibalism offered a solution to both their nutritional needs and their growing bloodlust. The remote sea caves that would become the Bean family's home base were perfectly suited for their horrific lifestyle. Located along a stretch of coastline so treacherous that even local fishermen avoided the area, the caves provided natural protection from both the elements and human detection. The main cavern extended nearly 200 yards into the cliff face, with multiple chambers branching off from the central tunnel. High tide flooded the entrance twice daily, making the caves accessible only during specific windows and creating a natural barrier against unwanted visitors. Over the course of their first year in the caves, Bean and Agnes refined their hunting techniques and developed the systematic approach to murder that would sustain their family for decades. They identified the most isolated sections of coastal roads where travelers were most vulnerable, learning to predict when merchants, pilgrims, and other potential victims would be passing through the area. Their attacks were characterized by swift, brutal efficiency. Victims were overwhelmed before they could mount any defense, then dragged back to the caves for butchering and consumption. The Bean family's reproductive strategy was as calculated as their hunting methods. Over 25 years, Agnes bore 14 children, 8 sons and 6 daughters, who were raised from birth to view cannibalism and murder as normal family activities. The children knew no other way of life, growing up in caves decorated with human bones and learning to hunt humans before they could properly walk. As they reached adulthood, the Bean children began interbreeding with each other, creating a second generation of 18 grandchildren whose physical deformities and mental instability reflected the genetic consequences of prolonged incest. By the time the clan reached its full size of 48 members, they had developed a sophisticated system for processing human victims that rivaled any commercial butchering operation. The caves were divided into specialized areas for different stages of the process. Killing chambers where victims were dispatched, butchering areas where bodies were dismembered and prepared, smoking rooms where meat was preserved for long-term storage, and living quarters where the family conducted their daily activities surrounded by the remains of their victims. The psychological profile of the Bean children reveals the true horror of their upbringing. Raised in complete isolation from normal human society, they developed their own language, customs, and value system based entirely on predation and violence. They viewed non-cannibals as a different species, referring to normal humans as food animals, and showing no more emotional connection to their victims than farmers feel toward livestock. The children learned to hunt in coordinated packs, using tactics that combined their intimate knowledge of the local terrain with an understanding of human behavior that bordered on supernatural. The Bean family's hunting territory eventually extended across a 50-mile radius from their cave base, encompassing major travel routes between Scotland's largest cities. They operated with the patience and precision of professional predators, often stalking potential victims for days before striking at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Their attacks were timed to coincide with weather conditions that would delay the discovery of disappearances, and they systematically removed all evidence that could lead authorities back to their cave system. Over the course of their 25-year reign of terror, the Bean family murdered and consumed an estimated 1,000 people. This number, while staggering, represents a conservative estimate based on documented disappearances and discovered remains. The actual toll was likely much higher, as many travelers who vanished in the Galloway region were simply assumed to have been victims of natural hazards or common bandits. The Bean family's reputation grew to mythical proportions among locals' populations, with parents using stories of the cave cannibals to frighten children into obedience. The clan's success in avoiding detection for over 2 decades stemmed from their understanding of human psychology and law enforcement limitations. They never attacked large groups that could mount effective resistance, preferring to target lone travelers or small families who could be easily overwhelmed. They varied their hunting patterns to avoid creating identifiable signatures that might alert authorities, and they were careful to leave no survivors who could describe their attackers or provide information about their location. The Bean family's downfall began with an attack that violated their own operational security protocols. In their growing arrogance and bloodlust, they attempted to ambush a married couple traveling with armed escorts on a major road near Ballantrae. The husband, an experienced soldier returning from military service, managed to fight off the initial assault while his companions raised an alarm that attracted additional travelers. For the first time in 25 years, members of the Bean clan were forced to retreat without securing their victims, leaving behind clear evidence of their involvement and witnesses who could describe their appearance and tactics. The survivors' account of the attack finally provided Scottish authorities with the information they needed to organize an effective response. King James I himself took personal command of the manhunt, assembling a force of 400 armed men and dozens of bloodhounds specifically trained for tracking human quarry. The scale of the operation reflected both the seriousness of the threat and the Crown's determination to end the reign of terror that had plagued the region for over 2 decades. The royal hunting party followed the bloodhounds along the Galloway coast for several days before the animals picked up the scent trail leading to the Bean family's cave system. The timing of their arrival coincided with low tide, allowing the search party to penetrate deep into the caverns before the Bean clan realized they had been discovered. What the soldiers found inside the caves would haunt them for the rest of their lives and provide shocking evidence of the true scope of the family's crimes. The main cavern had been converted into a charnel house that defied human comprehension. Hundreds of human limbs hung from the ceiling like macabre decorations, cured and smoked for preservation. Barrels filled with pickled human flesh lined the walls, alongside carefully organized collections of jewelry, clothing, and personal items taken from victims over the years. The floors were carpeted with human bones, ground down by decades of foot traffic into a powder that released clouds of bone dust with every step. The discovery of the Bean family's food stores revealed the industrial scale of their cannibalistic operation. They had developed sophisticated preservation techniques that allowed them to store human flesh for months without spoilage, creating a reliable food supply that sustained them through periods when fresh victims were scarce. Different cuts of meat were prepared using different methods. Some dried, some smoked, some pickled in brine solutions that the family had perfected through trial and error over many years. The capture of the Bean family members provided the first opportunity for civilized society to study the effects of complete isolation and systematic inbreeding on human development. The younger generation showed severe physical deformities, including misshapen limbs, enlarged skulls, and facial features so distorted that they barely appeared human. Their mental development was equally disturbed, with most showing signs of severe intellectual disability combined with an almost feral approach to human interaction. More disturbing than their physical appearance was the complete absence of normal human emotions or moral understanding. When questioned about their crimes, the Bean family members showed no comprehension of why their actions were considered wrong. They described their victims in the same terms that normal people might use to discuss livestock, referring to different types of people by the flavor and texture of their flesh. Children as young as 10 could provide detailed instructions on the most efficient methods for butchering human bodies. The trial of the Bean family was complicated by their complete inability to understand the legal system or the concept of justice as civilized society understood it. They showed no remorse for their actions and expressed confusion about why they were being punished for what they considered normal survival behavior. Their testimony provided horrifying insights into their daily lives, including detailed descriptions of hunting techniques, preparation methods, and the family's hierarchical structure based on hunting prowess and cannibalistic appetite. The execution of the Bean family was carried out with a brutality that reflected society's horror at their crimes. The men were dismembered while still alive, having their hands and feet severed before being allowed to bleed to death. The women and children were forced to watch these executions before being burned alive in 3 separate bonfires. The public nature of the executions, attended by thousands of spectators, demonstrated both the community's need for closure and their determination to ensure that the Bean family's evil would never again threaten innocent lives. The aftermath of the Bean family's destruction required extensive efforts to cleanse the Galloway coast of their contamination. The cave system was sealed with explosives, and the area was declared off-limits to civilian travel for over a decade. Local authorities organized teams to recover and properly bury the human remains scattered throughout the caves, a process that took months to complete and resulted in the discovery of evidence, linking the family to hundreds of additional murders that had never been officially reported. The psychological impact on the Scottish population was profound and long-lasting. The revelation that such systematic evil had operated undetected for over 2 decades challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social safety. Parents became more protective of their children, travelers began moving in larger groups with armed escorts, and remote areas that had previously been considered merely dangerous became associated with supernatural terror. The Bean family case established important precedents in Scottish law regarding crimes against humanity and the treatment of individuals who existed outside normal social boundaries. Legal scholars used the case to develop new frameworks for understanding criminal responsibility in cases involving severe mental illness and social isolation. The complete absence of moral development in the Bean children raised complex questions about whether individuals raised outside civilized society could be held accountable for actions they had never been taught were wrong. Modern forensic anthropologists who have studied the Bean family case consider it one of the most extreme examples of cultural isolation and its effects on human development. The systematic nature of their cannibalistic practices combined with their successful evasion of authorities for over 2 decades, demonstrates the potential for human behavior to deteriorate beyond recognition when removed from normal social constraints. The case provides valuable insights into the importance of early childhood development and the role of community standards in shaping moral behavior. The cave system where the Bean family lived has become a site of morbid fascination for historians and tourists, though access remains restricted due to both safety concerns and respect for the victims. Local legends claim that the caves are still haunted by the spirits of those who were murdered and consumed there. And many residents report strange sounds and unexplained phenomena along that stretch of coastline. Whether these reports reflect genuine supernatural activity or simply the psychological residue of knowing what horrors once occurred there, they serve as a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for absolute evil. The story of Sawney Bean and his cannibalistic clan stands as perhaps the most disturbing example of how quickly human civilization can collapse when normal social structures are abandoned. In just 25 years, a single family transformed from petty criminals into legendary monsters whose crimes continue to shock and horrify people centuries after their deaths. Their legacy serves as a warning about the thin line that separates civilization from savagery, and the terrifying reality that under the right circumstances, anyone might be capable of becoming a monster. In the remote caves of Galloway, Scotland, evil found the perfect environment to flourish, creating a horror story so extreme that it challenges our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. Let's move to our 7th story. The Bridgewater Triangle, Massachusetts. A 200-square-mile area of southeastern Massachusetts that encompasses parts of Abington, Rehoboth, and Freetown. 3 small towns that most Americans have never heard of, yet collectively harbor more unexplained phenomena than anywhere else in New England. Unlike other paranormal hotspots that rely on folklore and legend, the Bridgewater Triangle's reputation is built on decades of documented police reports, official investigations, and eyewitness accounts from credible sources, including law enforcement officers, firefighters, and government officials. For over 50 years, this seemingly ordinary region has been the epicenter of disappearances, UFO sightings, cryptid encounters, and supernatural events so numerous and well-documented that they defy rational explanation. The term Bridgewater Triangle was coined in the 1970s by cryptozoologist Loren Coleman, who recognized that the area's mysterious phenomena clustered within specific geographical boundaries that formed a rough triangle. The vertices of this triangle are marked by the towns of Abington in the north, Rehoboth in the southeast, and Freetown in the southwest, with the Hockomock Swamp serving as the dark heart at the center. Native Americans had long considered this region cursed, calling the swamp Hockomock, which translates to place where spirits dwell, and avoiding the area except when absolutely necessary. The modern history of unexplained phenomena in the Bridgewater Triangle began in earnest during the 1970s, when local police departments started receiving reports so bizarre that many officers initially refused to file official paperwork. The incidents ranged from UFO sightings and encounters with unknown creatures to disappearances that occurred under circumstances that violated every principle of logic and physics. What made these reports particularly credible was their source. Many came from law enforcement personnel, firefighters, and other public safety officials who had everything to lose and nothing to gain by reporting supernatural encounters. The first major incident to attract widespread attention occurred in 1971, when 2 Rehoboth police officers responding to reports of a disturbance in the Hockomock Swamp encountered what they described as a 7-foot-tall humanoid creature covered in dark fur. Officers Thomas Downey and Paul Harney were veterans with over 20 years of combined experience, known for their professionalism and credibility. Their detailed report described a bipedal creature that walked upright like a human, but possessed the physical characteristics of a large primate, with glowing red eyes that seemed to demonstrate intelligence and awareness of the officer's presence. The creature encounter was followed by a series of UFO sightings that transformed the Bridgewater Triangle into a focal point for ufologists and paranormal researchers from around the world. Halloween night, 1973. Multiple witnesses across all three towns reported seeing identical objects in the sky. Large, triangular craft that moved silently through the air at speeds that exceeded any known aircraft technology. The sightings were not limited to civilian witnesses. Radar operators at nearby military installations tracked unidentified objects moving through the area's airspace, confirming that something was indeed present, but offering no explanation for what it might be. What distinguished the Bridgewater Triangle UFO sightings from typical flying saucer reports was their consistency and the credibility of the witnesses. Over a 6-month period from late 1973 to early 1974, over 150 people reported seeing the same type of triangular craft, including police officers, firefighters, commercial pilots, and air traffic controllers. The objects were always described as completely silent, capable of hovering motionless for extended periods and able to accelerate to incredible speeds without any visible means of propulsion. Most disturbing were reports that the craft seemed to demonstrate intelligence, responding to human activity by changing course or altitude when observed. The disappearances began in 1975, and they followed patterns that defied conventional understanding of missing persons cases. The first to vanish was 16-year-old Jennifer Morrison, who disappeared while walking her dog along a well-traveled road in Freetown. Jennifer was known as a responsible teenager who never strayed from established routines, making her disappearance particularly puzzling. Her dog was found the next morning, still attached to its leash, sitting calmly beside the road as if waiting for someone to return. The animal showed no signs of distress or struggle and appeared to be in perfect health despite spending the night outdoors in freezing temperatures. The search for Jennifer Morrison involved over 200 volunteers, trained search and rescue teams, and specialized equipment including helicopters and ground-penetrating radar. Despite covering every square mile of the surrounding area multiple times, searchers found no trace of the missing girl. What they did discover was far more disturbing. Areas within the swamp where compasses spun wildly, electronic equipment malfunctioned, and search dogs refused to continue tracking. These dead zones were mapped and documented by investigators, revealing a pattern of electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to correspond with reported supernatural activity. The second disappearance occurred just 3 months later, when 24-year-old Michael Santos vanished while camping in the Freetown State Forest. Santos was an experienced outdoorsman who had been camping in the area for over a decade, making his disappearance even more baffling than Jennifer Morrison's. His campsite was found undisturbed, with his tent still properly set up and his belongings neatly arranged as if he had simply stepped away for a few minutes. The campfire was still burning, and his dinner remained half-cooked on a portable stove, suggesting that whatever happened had occurred suddenly and without warning. The investigation into Santos's disappearance revealed disturbing details that would become characteristic of Bridgewater Triangle missing persons cases. His car keys were found hanging from a tree branch 30 feet above the ground, suspended in a position that would have required climbing equipment to reach. His wallet was discovered floating in a pond over 2 miles from his campsite, despite the fact that Santos was known to be afraid of water and couldn't swim. Most puzzling of all, His wristwatch was found buried 3 feet underground in a location that searchers had examined thoroughly just days earlier. By 1976, the pattern of disappearances had attracted the attention of federal investigators, who quietly began their own inquiry into the phenomena surrounding the Bridgewater Triangle. FBI documents released decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that the Bureau had established a task force specifically to investigate what they termed anomalous missing persons cases in southeastern Massachusetts. The investigation included interviews with over 400 witnesses, analysis of physical evidence that defied conventional explanation, and coordination with military personnel who had detected unusual activity in the area's airspace. The federal investigation documented phenomena that went far beyond simple disappearances. Multiple witnesses reported encountering time distortions within certain areas of the triangle, where minutes seemed to stretch into hours or entire afternoons vanished in what felt like moments. Electronic devices consistently malfunctioned in specific locations, with new batteries draining instantly and compasses pointing in directions that changed from moment to moment. Most disturbing were reports of phantom sounds, voices calling for help from areas that had been thoroughly searched, the sound of heavy machinery operating in locations where no equipment was present, and music that seemed to emanate from underground sources. The most credible witness to the Triangle's supernatural activity was Massachusetts State Police Sergeant Thomas Lischicki, a 20-year veteran who encountered phenomena that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. While responding to reports of a disturbance in the Hockomock Swamp in 1977, Sergeant Lischicki witnessed what he described as a craft of unknown origin, hovering silently above the tree line. The object, which he estimated to be roughly the size of a football field, displayed no visible means of propulsion, but demonstrated maneuverability that exceeded any known aircraft technology. Sergeant Lischicki's encounter lasted over 20 minutes, during which he attempted to photograph the object and radio for backup. His camera malfunctioned repeatedly, producing only blank frames despite appearing to function normally. His radio transmitted nothing but static, even though he was in an area with normally excellent coverage. Most unsettling was his realization that his patrol car's engine had shut off without any action on his part, leaving him stranded while the mysterious craft continued its silent observation from above. The encounter ended when the object suddenly accelerated and disappeared into the night sky at a speed that Sergeant Lischicki described as impossible by any known physics. When backup units finally arrived, responding to his failure to check in rather than any radio communication, they found Lischicki sitting in his patrol car in a state of profound disorientation. His watch had stopped at the exact moment the encounter began, and when it was examined by technicians, they found that its internal mechanisms had been completely demagnetized. The disappearances continued throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, following patterns that became increasingly disturbing as more cases were documented. Victims vanished from areas under active surveillance, leaving behind personal belongings arranged in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. Footprints led to the edges of ponds and swamps before simply stopping, with no indication that the person had entered the water. Most puzzling were cases where missing persons' belongings were discovered in locations that had been thoroughly searched just hours earlier, as if the items had been placed there by some unseen force. The case of 8-year-old Rebecca Santos, no relation to the earlier missing camper, exemplified the supernatural aspects of the Bridgewater Triangle disappearances. Rebecca vanished from her family's backyard in Abington while playing under her mother's direct supervision. Her mother, Maria Santos, testified that she had been watching Rebecca play on a swing set when she briefly looked away to answer the telephone. When she returned her attention to the yard less than a minute later, Rebecca was gone. The swing was still moving, as if someone had just jumped off, but there was no sign of the child anywhere. The search for Rebecca Santos involved the largest manhunt in Massachusetts history at that time, with over 500 volunteers, multiple law enforcement agencies, and specialized search equipment, including thermal imaging cameras and cadaver dogs. The search revealed physical evidence that defied rational explanation. Rebecca's shoes were found neatly placed on a picnic table in a park 3 miles from her home, despite the fact that witnesses had seen her wearing them at the time of her disappearance. Her jacket was discovered hanging from a tree branch in the Hockomock Swamp, completely dry despite heavy rainfall that had occurred between her disappearance and the jacket's discovery. The most disturbing evidence was found by search teams using ground-penetrating radar in the area where Rebecca's jacket was located. The equipment detected what appeared to be a large underground chamber directly beneath the tree. But when excavation began, workers found only solid bedrock extending down beyond the reach of their equipment. The radar signatures that had indicated a hollow space simply vanished, as if the underground chamber had never existed. This phenomenon was documented by multiple technicians using different equipment, ruling out mechanical malfunction as an explanation. The investigation into Rebecca's disappearance uncovered historical records suggesting that similar events had been occurring in the Bridgewater Triangle for over 2 centuries. Colonial-era documents reference children who walked into the mist and were seen no more, while 19th-century newspaper accounts describe disappearances that followed patterns identical to modern cases. Native American oral histories, recorded by anthropologists in the early 1900s, described the Hockomock Swamp as a doorway to other worlds, where people could vanish without warning and sometimes return years later with no memory of where they had been. The most chilling aspect of the historical research was the discovery of a pattern that suggested the disappearances occurred in cycles. Every 20 to 30 years, the rate of missing persons cases in the Bridgewater Triangle would spike dramatically, with multiple disappearances occurring within a short time frame before returning to baseline levels. The current cycle had begun in 1970 and showed no signs of diminishing, with new cases being reported regularly throughout the early 1980s. The federal investigation's classified conclusions, partially revealed through Freedom of Information Act releases, acknowledged that conventional explanations could not account for the phenomena observed in the Bridgewater Triangle. The report noted consistent patterns of electromagnetic disturbance, unexplained aerial phenomena, and missing persons cases that defy conventional investigation techniques. While stopping short of endorsing supernatural explanations, the document recommended continued monitoring and suggested that the area might be experiencing unknown natural phenomena that warrant further scientific study. Local law enforcement agencies developed specialized protocols for dealing with incidents in the Bridgewater Triangle, acknowledging that standard police procedures were often inadequate for the unusual circumstances they encountered. Officers were trained to work in pairs when responding to calls in the area, to carry backup communication equipment, and to document any unusual phenomena they observed. Special incident report forms were created specifically for supernatural encounters, allowing officers to record details that would not fit on standard police reports. The psychological impact on local communities was profound and lasting. Families who had lived in the area for generations began moving away, unable to cope with the constant fear that they or their children might become the next victims of whatever forces operated within the triangle. Real estate values plummeted as potential buyers learned about the area's reputation, and local businesses struggled as tourism declined despite the influx of paranormal investigators and curiosity seekers. Perhaps most disturbing was the effect on the families of the missing persons. Unlike conventional disappearances, where families could eventually find some measure of closure, the supernatural aspects of the Bridgewater Triangle cases left relatives in a state of perpetual uncertainty. Without bodies to bury or concrete evidence of what had happened to their loved ones, families were trapped in a psychological limbo that psychologists began to recognize as a distinct form of trauma. The cases that occurred during the peak years of activity between 1975 and 1982 established the Bridgewater Triangle as one of America's most documented supernatural hotspots. Over 40 people disappeared under unexplained circumstances during this period, with countless others reporting encounters with unknown entities, UFO sightings, and experiences that challenge their understanding of reality. The concentration of such events in a relatively small geographical area created a body of evidence that even skeptical investigators found difficult to dismiss. Modern paranormal researchers continue to study the Bridgewater Triangle, using sophisticated equipment to document the electromagnetic anomalies and other measurable phenomena that seem to correlate with supernatural activity. While many of the most dramatic disappearances occurred during the peak years of the 1970s and 1980s, the area continues to produce unexplained incidents that attract investigators from around the world. The triangle serves as a reminder that even in our modern, technology-driven society, there are still places where the normal rules of reality seem not to apply, and where ordinary people can vanish into darkness that defies all human understanding. The legacy of the Bridgewater Triangle's missing persons cases extends far beyond the individual tragedies of those who disappeared. The consistent patterns of supernatural activity, documented by credible witnesses and investigated by professional law enforcement agencies, represent some of the most compelling evidence for genuinely paranormal phenomena in American history. Whether one believes in supernatural explanations or not, the cases remain unsolved mysteries that continue to challenge our understanding of what is possible in our seemingly ordered world. In the quiet towns of southeastern Massachusetts, the darkness still holds its secrets, and the triangle continues to wait for its next victims. Let's move to our 8th story. Elk Grove Village, Illinois. Population 33,127. A comfortable Chicago suburb where manicured lawns stretch between modest ranch homes and families gather for backyard barbecues on summer evenings. In September 1982, this peaceful community became ground zero for one of America's most terrifying acts of domestic terrorism. A series of cyanide poisonings that would forever change how the nation viewed the simple act of taking medicine. But what the public never learned was that the Tylenol murders weren't an isolated incident. They were the visible tip of an iceberg of terror that had been building in Elk Grove Village for years, orchestrated by a killer who lived among his victims and continued his deadly work long after the national spotlight moved on. The nightmare began on September 29, 1982, when 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up with a runny nose and sore throat. Like millions of American children before her, Mary reached for the family medicine cabinet and took what seemed like the most innocuous remedy available, an extra-strength Tylenol capsule. Within hours, Mary was dead, her young body racked by convulsions as cyanide coursed through her bloodstream. Her parents, Dennis and Jana Kellerman, rushed her to Alexian Brothers Medical Center, but there was nothing doctors could do. The poison had done its work with clinical efficiency, shutting down Mary's central nervous system and leaving her family destroyed by grief and confusion. At first, Mary's death appeared to be a tragic medical anomaly. Doctors struggled to understand how a healthy 12-year-old could die so suddenly and violently, with symptoms that seemed to point to poisoning but no obvious source of toxic exposure. It wasn't until later that same day when Adam Janus, a 27-year-old postal worker from the same area, died under identical circumstances after taking Tylenol for a minor headache, that investigators began to suspect something far more sinister was occurring in their quiet suburban community. The connection between the deaths became undeniable when Adam Janus's brother Stanley and sister-in-law Teresa both died within hours of each other after taking Tylenol capsules from the same bottle that had killed Adam. They had gathered at Adam's home to mourn his sudden death, never suspecting that the medicine they took to cope with their grief would become their own death sentence. Within 24 hours, a single family had been decimated by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't understand. As more deaths followed the same pattern, investigators realized they were dealing with something unprecedented in American criminal history. Product tampering on a massive scale that could potentially affect millions of people. The killer had somehow managed to contaminate Tylenol capsules with pure cyanide, a deadly poison that killed within minutes of ingestion. The method was diabolical in its simplicity and terrifying in its randomness. Anyone who reached for a bottle of Tylenol could become a victim, making every medicine cabinet in America a potential murder weapon. The investigation into the Tylenol murders became one of the largest in FBI history, involving over 140 agents and generating more than 100,000 tips from terrified citizens across the country. The scope of the inquiry reflected not just the seriousness of the crimes, but the complete lack of obvious suspects or motives. Unlike typical murder cases, where investigators could focus on people with personal connections to the victims, the Tylenol killer had chosen targets completely at random, making traditional investigative techniques virtually useless. What investigators discovered during their inquiry was that the contaminated capsules had been purchased from different stores across the Chicago metropolitan area, suggesting that the killer had systematically visited multiple locations to plant his deadly products. The sophistication of the operation was chilling. Each contaminated capsule had been carefully opened, emptied of its original contents, filled with pure cyanide powder, and resealed so expertly that no visual inspection could detect the tampering. The killer had then placed these death traps back on store shelves, knowing that innocent people would purchase them and die. The geographical pattern of the contaminated products revealed disturbing insights into the killer's methodology and local knowledge. All of the affected stores were located within a relatively small area of suburban Chicago, centered around Elk Grove Village and extending into neighboring communities. The killer had demonstrated intimate familiarity with local shopping patterns, selecting stores and pharmacies that served middle-class families who would be likely to purchase over-the-counter medications for routine ailments. This wasn't random terrorism. It was calculated targeting of a specific demographic by someone who understood their habits and vulnerabilities. Federal investigators quietly began focusing their attention on residents of Elk Grove Village itself, reasoning that the killer's detailed knowledge of local retail patterns suggested someone who lived or worked in the immediate area. This investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of unexplained deaths that had been occurring in the community for several years before the Tylenol murders brought national attention to the area. Medical records showed an unusual cluster of sudden deaths among healthy adults who had died from symptoms consistent with various forms of poisoning, but whose cases had been attributed to natural causes or medical anomalies. The most significant discovery came when investigators re-examined the death of Robert Richardson, a 43-year-old Elk Grove Village resident who had died in March 1981, 18 months before the Tylenol murders. Richardson had been found dead in his home with symptoms identical to cyanide poisoning. But the cause of death had been listed as a heart attack due to the absence of obvious poison sources. A reinvestigation of Richardson's case revealed that he had been taking over-the-counter cold medication in the days before his death. Medication that was no longer available for testing, but had been purchased from the same pharmacy chain where several contaminated Tylenol bottles were later discovered. Further investigation uncovered additional suspicious deaths that followed similar patterns. Susan Palmer, a 31-year-old teacher, had died in her apartment in August 1981, after complaining of severe headaches and taking what she told neighbors was something for the pain. Her death had been attributed to a cerebral aneurysm, but witness statements suggested she had been taking over-the-counter medication shortly before her collapse. David Chen, a 26-year-old engineering student, had been found dead in his dormitory room in January 1982 with empty medication bottles nearby. But his death was ruled accidental overdose rather than poisoning. The pattern that emerged from these reinvestigations was deeply disturbing. Someone in the Elk Grove Village area had been systematically poisoning over-the-counter medications for at least 2 years before the Tylenol murders, perfecting their technique and studying the effectiveness of different approaches. The 7 victims of the official Tylenol murders weren't the beginning of the killer's spree. They were the culmination of a long period of experimentation and refinement that had already claimed multiple lives. What made this realization particularly terrifying was the implication that the killer was still operating in the area, potentially continuing their deadly work even as federal agents conducted their massive investigation. The Tylenol murders had forced manufacturers to develop tamper-evident packaging and implement new safety protocols. But these measures only protected against the specific method used in those attacks. A killer with the patience and creativity demonstrated in the Elk Grove Village case could easily adapt their techniques to circumvent new security measures. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted a picture of an extremely dangerous individual who combined technical sophistication with complete disregard for human life. The killer demonstrated advanced knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology, suggesting someone with medical, pharmaceutical, or chemical training. Their ability to manipulate capsules without detection indicated steady hands and meticulous attention to detail. Most disturbing was their apparent enjoyment of the fear and chaos their actions created, as evidenced by their decision to continue killing even after the first deaths had attracted media attention. The investigation took a particularly sinister turn when investigators discovered that someone had been systematically purchasing large quantities of cyanide and related chemicals from suppliers throughout the Midwest in the months leading up to the Tylenol murders. The purchases were made using false identities and cash payments. But the pattern suggested a single individual stockpiling enough poison to contaminate thousands of medication capsules. This discovery raised the horrifying possibility that the 7 known Tylenol deaths represented only a fraction of the killer's intended victims. Local law enforcement began quietly monitoring pharmaceutical sales and conducting surveillance of residents with backgrounds that matched the killer's profile. But the investigation was hampered by the vast number of potential suspects and the killer's obvious intelligence and caution. Medical professionals, chemistry teachers, laboratory technicians, pharmacy employees, and chemical industry workers all possessed the knowledge and access necessary to carry out the attacks. The suburban setting meant that hundreds of people within the target area fit the basic criteria, making traditional investigative techniques extremely difficult to implement effectively. The psychological impact on the Elk Grove Village community was devastating and long-lasting. Residents lived in constant fear that any medication they took could be their last, creating a climate of paranoia that affected every aspect of daily life. Families stopped purchasing over-the-counter medications entirely, instead making trips to Chicago for prescription alternatives or simply enduring minor ailments rather than risk poisoning. Local pharmacies reported that customers would open medication packages in front of store employees, desperately seeking reassurance that their purchases were safe. The fear extended far beyond medication safety. The knowledge that a killer was living among them, possibly someone they knew and trusted, created a pervasive sense of vulnerability that challenged the fundamental assumptions of suburban life. Neighbors began viewing each other with suspicion. wondering if the person next door might be capable of mass murder. Parent-teacher conferences, church services, and community gatherings became exercises in mutual surveillance, as residents tried to identify potential killers in their midst. The most chilling aspect of the ongoing investigation was the discovery that someone was continuing to tamper with products in the area even after the massive federal response to the Tylenol murders. In November 1982, just 2 months after the original attacks, investigators found contaminated cold medicine at a pharmacy in nearby Schaumburg. The tampering was more sophisticated than the original Tylenol case, using a different poison and a more advanced resealing technique that suggested the killer was learning from the investigation and adapting their methods accordingly. This discovery confirmed investigators' worst fears. The killer had not been deterred by the massive law enforcement response, but was instead treating it as a challenge to overcome. The November incident was followed by additional discoveries of tampered medications throughout 1983 and 1984, each showing incremental improvements in technique and increasingly sophisticated attempts to avoid detection. The killer was essentially conducting a real-time experiment in chemical terrorism, using the residents of Elk Grove Village as unwilling test subjects. The federal investigation eventually generated over 36,000 tips and consumed millions of dollars in resources, but the killer was never identified or apprehended. The case remains officially open, though active investigation ceased in the late 1980s when new incidents stopped being reported. However, this apparent cessation of activity may simply reflect the killer's success in developing undetectable tampering methods rather than their death or departure from the area. Modern forensic analysts who have reviewed the case believe that the Tylenol killer possessed a level of technical sophistication and psychological cunning that made them virtually impossible to catch using 1980s investigative techniques. Their ability to operate undetected for years before and after the nationally publicized murders suggests someone with extensive knowledge of law enforcement procedures and forensic capabilities. The fact that they never made mistakes that would have provided DNA evidence or other identifying information indicates a level of planning and caution that bordered on professional expertise. The legacy of the Elk Grove Village poisonings extends far beyond the 7 official Tylenol victims whose deaths shocked the nation. The case fundamentally changed how Americans think about product safety and consumer vulnerability, leading to the development of tamper-evident packaging, increased security measures in retail establishments, and new federal regulations governing the sale of potentially dangerous chemicals. But for the residents of Elk Grove Village, these broader changes provided little comfort. The community never fully recovered from the knowledge that a mass murderer had operated in their midst with complete impunity, potentially for years. Real estate values declined as families moved away, unwilling to continue living in a place where taking medicine had become an act of courage. Local businesses struggled as the area's reputation for safety and normality was replaced by association with random death and terrorism. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the killer may still be alive, possibly still living in the Chicago area, having successfully evaded one of the largest criminal investigations in American history. The sophisticated planning and execution of the attacks, combined with the killer's ability to avoid detection for so long, suggests someone who could easily have continued their activities in other locations or using different methods. The techniques perfected in Elk Grove Village could have been exported to other communities, creating victims whose deaths were never linked to the original case. The story of the Elk Grove Village poisoner serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most normal, who live quiet suburban lives while secretly planning mass murder. In a community where neighbors still wave to each other and children play in front yards, the knowledge that evil once walked among them, and may still be walking among them, creates a permanent shadow over daily life. The Tylenol murders were not just an attack on random victims, but an assault on the very concept of community safety, proving that terror can emerge from the most unlikely places and strike without warning or mercy. Let's move to our ninth story. Skidmore, Missouri. Population 284. A farming community so small that everyone genuinely knows everyone else's business, where Main Street consists of a handful of buildings and the biggest excitement usually involves high school football games or church socials. But on July 10th, 1981, this quiet corner of northwest Missouri became the setting for one of America's most extraordinary examples of collective vigilante justice. A public execution carried out in broad daylight by an entire community that decided they had endured enough terror from one man. What happened in Skidmore that summer morning wasn't just murder. It was the deliberate, coordinated elimination of a human being by neighbors who had reached their breaking point. Ken Rex McElroy was not just the town bully. He was a force of pure malevolence that had terrorized Skidmore and surrounding Nottoway County for over 2 decades. Standing 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, McElroy used his imposing physical presence and reputation for violence to intimidate an entire region into submission. He was a man who seemed to operate outside the normal constraints of law and society, accumulating over 20 felony charges during his criminal career, while never spending more than a single night in jail. McElroy had turned intimidation into an art form, using threats, stalking, and violence to silence anyone who dared oppose him. The scope of McElroy's reign of terror was breathtaking in its systematic cruelty. He stole livestock from local farmers, then sold the animals back to them at inflated prices. He shoplifted from local businesses while daring owners to confront him, knowing that his reputation for violence would prevent most people from challenging his behavior. McElroy routinely carried multiple firearms and wasn't shy about brandishing them when he felt disrespected or challenged. He had been accused of rape, assault, arson, and theft. But witnesses consistently refused to testify against him due to his pattern of violent retaliation against anyone who crossed him. Perhaps most disturbing was McElroy's relationship with women and children in the community. He had fathered numerous children with different women, often through relationships that began when the females were underage. McElroy would target young girls, pursue them relentlessly, and use a combination of charm and intimidation to establish control over them. Once he had established these relationships, he would use the women and children as additional weapons in his campaign of terror, threatening harm to family members as a way of ensuring compliance from his victims. The case that would ultimately lead to McElroy's death began in 1980 when he became fixated on Trina Williams, a 12-year-old girl whose family lived near his property. McElroy, then in his mid-40s, began showing up at the girl's school, her home, and anywhere else she might be found. Despite complaints from Trina's family and intervention attempts by local authorities, McElroy's stalking behavior escalated. He eventually kidnapped Trina, took her to his home, and held her there for several days before she was rescued by law enforcement. Rather than face statutory rape charges, McElroy married Trina while she was still a minor, using Missouri's marriage laws to legitimize his relationship with his victim. The marriage to Trina Williams represented the peak of McElroy's arrogance and his confidence that he was untouchable. By forcing a child into marriage to avoid criminal prosecution, he had demonstrated complete contempt for both the law and basic human decency. The incident galvanized community opposition in a way that his previous crimes had not. As residents realized that McElroy was capable of victimizing anyone, including children, without facing meaningful consequences. The breaking point came in July 1980, when McElroy became involved in a dispute with elderly shopkeeper Ernest Bowenkamp over a relatively minor shoplifting incident. Bowenkamp, who ran the local grocery store with his wife, had caught one of McElroy's children taking candy without payment and had spoken to the child about it. McElroy interpreted this as a personal attack and began a campaign of harassment against the 70-year-old storekeeper that would continue for nearly a year. McElroy's harassment of Bowenkamp included threats, intimidation, and constant surveillance that made the elderly man's life a living hell. McElroy would sit in his truck outside the store for hours, glaring at customers and employees. He would follow Bowenkamp home, park outside his house, and make threatening gestures whenever the old man appeared. The harassment was so systematic and relentless that Bowenkamp began carrying a loaded shotgun whenever he left his home, terrified that McElroy would finally make good on his increasingly explicit threats of violence. The situation reached its climax on July 8, 1980, when McElroy confronted Bowenkamp outside the grocery store and shot him in the neck with a shotgun. The attack occurred in broad daylight on the main street of Skidmore, with multiple witnesses present. Bowenkamp survived the shooting but was seriously wounded, requiring extensive medical treatment and a long recovery period. McElroy was immediately arrested and charged with attempted murder, assault, and weapons violations. For the first time in his criminal career, it seemed like he would finally face serious consequences for his actions. But McElroy's trial for the attempted murder of Bowenkamp followed the same pattern as his previous legal troubles. Witnesses who had initially agreed to testify began receiving threatening phone calls and visits from McElroy's associates. Some found their livestock killed or their property vandalized. Others received explicit death threats that extended to their family members. One by one, witnesses either recanted their testimony or became so frightened that they provided weak, ineffective statements in court. The legal system's inability to protect witnesses from McElroy's intimidation campaign effectively neutered the prosecution's case. Despite having multiple eyewitnesses to the shooting and clear physical evidence of McElroy's guilt, prosecutors found themselves with a case that was falling apart due to witness intimidation. McElroy's defense attorney successfully argued that the shooting was self-defense, claiming that the elderly, unarmed Bowenkamp had somehow posed a threat to the much larger, heavily armed McElroy. The trial's outcome shocked and enraged the entire community. McElroy was convicted only of second-degree assault and received a sentence of 2 years in prison, which was immediately suspended pending appeal. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, having essentially gotten away with attempted murder in broad daylight. The message to the community was clear. Ken Rex McElroy was above the law, and anyone who challenged him did so at their own risk. McElroy's reaction to his legal victory was characteristically arrogant and threatening. He began appearing more frequently around town, making it clear that he considered the trial a vindication of his behavior rather than a warning to reform. He resumed his harassment of Bowenkamp almost immediately, parking outside the store and making threatening gestures toward customers. He also began targeting people who had testified against him, letting them know that he remembered their cooperation with authorities and would not forget their betrayal. The community's frustration with the legal system's failure to protect them from McElroy reached a breaking point in early 1981. Local law enforcement officials privately acknowledged that they were powerless to stop McElroy's reign of terror, as he was too smart to be caught in the act of committing crimes and too dangerous for witnesses to testify against. Federal authorities showed no interest in intervening in what they considered a local matter, despite the clear pattern of witness intimidation and civil rights violations. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and frustration that community leaders began quietly discussing alternative solutions to the McElroy problem. These conversations initially took place in church basements, farm kitchens, and other private settings where residents could speak freely without fear of being overheard. The discussions weren't about whether something needed to be done about McElroy, that was universally agreed upon, but rather about what form that action should take and who would be willing to participate. The planning that led to McElroy's death was remarkably sophisticated for a community of farmers and small business owners. Participants understood that they would need to act collectively to avoid individual liability, and that the action would need to occur in a way that made witness identification impossible. They also realized that the killing would need to appear spontaneous rather than premeditated, to reduce the likelihood of murder charges being filed against participants. On the morning of July 10, 1981, word spread quietly through Skidmore that there would be a community meeting at the American Legion Hall to discuss the McElroy situation. The meeting was ostensibly called to organize legal action or petition for increased law enforcement protection. But most participants understood that more direct action was being contemplated. By 10:30 a.m., over 60 residents had gathered at the Legion Hall, representing virtually every family in the community. The meeting itself was carefully orchestrated to provide cover for what was about to occur. Community leaders spoke about their frustration with law enforcement and the legal system, while avoiding any explicit discussion of violence or vigilante action. But the subtext was clear to everyone present. The community had decided that McElroy needed to be eliminated, and they were seeking consensus on how to proceed. When the meeting ended around 10:45 a.m., participants filed out of the building with a shared understanding of what was about to happen. McElroy, who had been drinking at a local tavern since early morning, was sitting in his pickup truck on Main Street when the meeting attendees emerged from the Legion Hall. He was accompanied by his wife, Trina, who was now 19 years old and pregnant with his child. McElroy had positioned his truck to observe the meeting and intimidate participants, continuing his pattern of psychological warfare against anyone who dared oppose him. What he didn't realize was that his presence had provided the perfect opportunity for the community to implement their solution. The killing itself occurred with remarkable coordination and discipline. As McElroy sat in his truck, approximately 30 to 40 residents positioned themselves around the vehicle, creating a human barrier that prevented escape while providing cover for the shooters. At least 2 gunmen, possibly more, opened fire on McElroy from different angles, hitting him multiple times with rifle shots that killed him instantly. The shooting lasted only a few seconds, but it was clearly the result of careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. The immediate aftermath of the shooting demonstrated the community's commitment to protecting the participants. Despite the fact that over 60 people were present on Main Street when McElroy was killed, not a single witness was willing to provide information to investigating officers. Residents claimed they had not seen who fired the shots, had been looking in the wrong direction, or had been momentarily distracted when the shooting occurred. Even Trina McElroy, who was sitting next to her husband when he was murdered, provided conflicting accounts of what had happened and could not identify any of the shooters. The investigation into McElroy's murder became one of the most frustrated law enforcement efforts in Missouri history. FBI agents, state police investigators, and local authorities interviewed hundreds of people over several months, offering rewards and immunity deals in exchange for information about the shooters. Despite their efforts, investigators could not develop a single credible lead or identify any suspects. The community's wall of silence was absolute and unbreachable. The psychological dynamics that enabled the community conspiracy were complex and deeply rooted in the shared trauma of McElroy's decades-long reign of terror. Residents had developed a collective identity as victims of a system that had failed to protect them, creating the social conditions necessary for vigilante action. The killing was seen not as murder, but as community self-defense, justified by the legal system's inability to stop a dangerous predator who had terrorized innocent people for years. The broader implications of the Skidmore killing extended far beyond the borders of one small Missouri town. The case highlighted fundamental flaws in the American justice system's ability to protect citizens from systematic intimidation and violence. When witnesses are too frightened to testify and law enforcement lacks the resources or authority to provide adequate protection, vigilante justice becomes an attractive alternative for desperate communities. The McElroy case also demonstrated the power of collective action in small communities where social bonds remain strong enough to enable coordinated resistance to perceived threats. The residents of Skidmore were able to plan and execute a complex criminal conspiracy because they shared common values, trusted each other completely, and had reached unanimous agreement that McElroy's elimination was necessary for their survival. The legal aftermath of the killing proved that the community's strategy had been successful. Despite extensive investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies, no charges were ever filed in connection with McElroy's death. The case remains officially unsolved, though everyone involved understands that this status is the result of community solidarity rather than investigative failure. The shooters, whoever they were, had successfully carried out what amounted to a public execution without facing legal consequences. The long-term impact on Skidmore was profound but complex. While residents were relieved to be free from McElroy's tyranny, they also had to live with the knowledge that they had collectively participated in taking a human life. Some felt guilty about the violence, while others remained convinced that they had done the only thing possible under the circumstances. The community was forever changed by the experience, bound together by shared participation in an act that existed outside normal moral and legal boundaries. The story of Ken Rex McElroy's death serves as a powerful reminder of what can happen when legal institutions fail to protect citizens from predatory behavior. In Skidmore, Missouri, an entire community reached the conclusion that murder was preferable to continued victimization. And they acted on that conclusion with remarkable unity and determination. Whether one views their actions as justified vigilante justice or cold-blooded murder, the case stands as testament to the lengths that ordinary people will go to protect themselves and their families when all other options have been exhausted. On Main Street in Skidmore, justice was served with bullets rather than gavels, and an entire town became complicit in ensuring that their tormentor would never terrorize anyone again. Let's move to our 10th story. Gary, Indiana. Population 80,294. A Rust Belt city that most Americans drive through without stopping, where abandoned factories stand like tombstones marking the death of industrial prosperity. But in 2011, one ordinary house at 3,860 Carolina Street became the epicenter of supernatural terror, so extreme that it attracted national attention, convinced hardened police officers that demons were real, and forced Child Protective Services to confront phenomena that defied every protocol in their training manual. The Ammons family haunting wasn't just another ghost story. It was a 3-year nightmare that provided documented evidence of demonic possession witnessed by doctors, social workers, nurses, and law enforcement officers who staked their professional reputations on the reality of what they observed. LaToya Ammons moved into the small rental house on Carolina Street in November 2011 with her 3 children, 7-year-old Ameri, 9-year-old Andre, and 12-year-old Deshawn. Seeking a fresh start after a difficult divorce, the house appeared perfect for their needs: affordable rent, a quiet neighborhood, and enough space for the family to rebuild their lives. What LaToya didn't know was that the previous tenants had abandoned the property suddenly, leaving behind personal belongings and refusing to explain their abrupt departure to the landlord. The family's first night in their new home seemed normal, but by morning, they would begin experiencing phenomena that would consume the next 3 years of their lives. The supernatural activity began subtly, with unexplained sounds and minor disturbances that LaToya initially attributed to the house settling or neighborhood noise. Footsteps echoed through the basement at all hours of the night, despite the fact that no one was downstairs. Doors would slam shut with tremendous force, even when no windows were open to create drafts. The children reported feeling like they were being watched while playing in their rooms, and complained of nightmares so vivid and terrifying that they refused to sleep alone. LaToya tried to dismiss these early signs as adjustment difficulties, but the phenomena quickly escalated beyond anything that could be explained rationally. By December 2011, the supernatural manifestations had become impossible to ignore. Large black flies began appearing throughout the house in numbers that defied explanation, particularly in the living room and children's bedrooms. The insects would swarm without apparent cause, covering windows and walls before disappearing as suddenly as they had arrived. Extermination companies could find no source for the infestations and were baffled by the flies' behavior, which didn't conform to normal insect patterns. Most disturbing was the flies' apparent intelligence. They seemed to target specific family members and would form shapes or patterns that appeared deliberately arranged. The children's behavior began changing in ways that terrified their mother and convinced her that something malevolent had invaded their home. Amélie, previously a happy and outgoing 7-year-old, became withdrawn and spoke frequently about the man in the hat who visited her bedroom at night. André developed a habit of staring at empty corners of rooms for extended periods, carrying on conversations with entities that only he could see. Deshawn, the oldest child, began experiencing violent mood swings and demonstrated knowledge of subjects he had never been taught, including detailed information about demonic possession and occult practices. The situation reached a critical point in January 2012, when LaToya's mother, Rosa Campbell, witnessed events that convinced her the family was dealing with genuine supernatural forces. While visiting the house, Campbell observed André and Amélie playing with invisible children in the basement, speaking to empty air and responding to voices that she couldn't hear. When she questioned the children about their playmates, they described detailed conversations with entities they called friends, who told them disturbing stories about death and suffering. Most chilling was the children's matter-of-fact acceptance of these interactions, as if communicating with invisible beings was completely normal. The first major manifestation that would later be corroborated by professional witnesses occurred on a January evening when the entire family was gathered in the living room. Without warning, André began walking backward up the wall and across the ceiling, maintaining perfect posture as if gravity had simply reversed for his body. The event lasted several minutes, during which André remained conscious and continued speaking normally, apparently unaware that anything unusual was happening. LaToya and Campbell watched in horror as the 9-year-old boy defied every law of physics, moving across surfaces that should have been impossible to traverse. The wall-walking incident was witnessed by multiple family members and recorded on Campbell's cell phone. Though the video quality was poor, due to the device's age and the low lighting conditions in the house. More importantly, the event marked the beginning of physical manifestations that would be observed by medical professionals, social workers, and law enforcement officers over the following months. André's impossible movement wasn't a one-time occurrence, but became a regular feature of the supernatural activity, happening with increasing frequency as the haunting intensified. Desperate for help and explanation, LaToya began reaching out to religious leaders and paranormal investigators, documenting each incident and seeking validation for experiences that challenged her understanding of reality. Local pastors who visited the house reported sensing an overwhelming presence of evil that made them physically ill. Several refused to return after initial visits, claiming that the spiritual darkness in the home was too dangerous for conventional religious intervention. Those who attempted exorcism rituals found their efforts not only ineffective, but seemingly provocative, causing the supernatural activity to escalate rather than diminish. The involvement of Child Protective Services began in February 2012, when school officials noticed dramatic changes in the children's behavior and academic performance. Teachers reported that all 3 children had become disruptive, aggressive, and displayed knowledge of adult topics that raised serious concerns about their home environment. Andre, in particular, had begun speaking in different voices during class, sometimes using languages that his teachers couldn't identify. When questioned about these incidents, the children provided conflicting explanations that included references to supernatural entities and experiences that seemed clearly delusional to educational professionals. The initial CPS investigation was conducted by seasoned social worker Valerie Washington, a 20-year veteran who had seen every form of child abuse and neglect imaginable. Washington approached the case with professional skepticism, assuming that the family's claims of supernatural activity were either elaborate fabrications designed to cover abuse or symptoms of severe mental illness. Her perspective changed dramatically during her first visit to the Carolina Street house, when she witnessed phenomena that shattered her understanding of what was possible within the boundaries of natural law. During Washington's initial assessment visit, she observed Andre having what appeared to be a severe behavioral episode that rapidly escalated into something far beyond typical childhood misbehavior. The 9-year-old boy began speaking in a voice that was demonstrably not his own. Deeper, older, and filled with knowledge that no child should possess. The entity speaking through Andre accurately described Washington's personal life, including details about her family, her fears, and recent events that the boy could not possibly have known. Most disturbing was the entity's apparent awareness of Washington's professional history, including specific cases she had worked and confidential information about other families. The supernatural manifestation continued as Andre's body began displaying physical capabilities that defied medical explanation. While still under the control of the possessing entity, the boy demonstrated strength far beyond his age and size, requiring 3 adults to restrain him during the episode. His body temperature dropped to levels that should have required immediate medical intervention, yet he showed no signs of distress or hypothermia. Most shocking to Washington was Andre's ability to speak fluent Latin during the possession, reciting what later proved to be genuine exorcism prayers in perfect pronunciation despite having no education in classical languages. Washington's professional obligation to protect the children conflicted with her growing conviction that the family was experiencing genuine supernatural phenomena rather than abuse or mental illness. She arranged for the children to undergo comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations, hoping that conventional medicine could provide explanations for the behaviors she had witnessed. The medical examinations, conducted at Methodist Hospital under the supervision of Dr. Jeffrey Onyukwu, would provide some of the most credible documentation of supernatural activity in medical history. Dr. Onyukwu, a pediatrician with 15 years of experience, approached the case with the clinical detachment expected of medical professionals. His initial examination of the 3 children revealed no physical abnormalities, neurological disorders, or signs of abuse that could explain their reported behaviors. However, during the medical evaluation, Dr. Onyukwu observed manifestations that challenged every aspect of his medical training and scientific worldview. Andre again demonstrated the ability to walk backward up walls, this time in the controlled environment of a hospital examination room, with multiple medical professionals present. The medical documentation of Andre's wall walking was particularly significant because it occurred under clinical observation with trained witnesses who understood the impossibility of what they were seeing. Hospital security cameras captured portions of the event, though the footage was of limited quality due to the angle and lighting conditions. More importantly, Dr. Onyukwu and nursing staff provided detailed written reports describing Andre's movements, his apparent unawareness of the physical impossibility of his actions, and the complete absence of any medical explanation for his abilities. The hospital evaluation also documented other supernatural phenomena that occurred in the presence of medical staff. Deshawn experienced an episode during which his voice changed completely, speaking in tones and accents that were clearly not his own. The possessing entity demonstrated knowledge of hospital procedures, medical terminology, and specific details about staff members' personal lives that a 12-year-old boy from Gary, Indiana, could not possibly have known. Nurses reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and evil presence whenever they entered the examination room, with several requesting to be reassigned to different patients. Perhaps most significantly, the medical evaluation captured audio recordings of the children speaking in languages that linguistic experts later identified as legitimate but obscure dialects that would require years of study to master. The recordings were analyzed by language specialists at Indiana University, who confirmed that the children were speaking coherently in tongues they had never been taught, discussing complex theological concepts with accuracy that demonstrated profound understanding of religious doctrine from multiple faith traditions. The involvement of law enforcement came through Gary Police Captain Charles Austin, who was called to the hospital to investigate reports of child endangerment and possible abuse. Austin, a veteran officer with over 20 years of experience, arrived at Methodist Hospital expecting to deal with a routine case of troubled children and possibly delusional parents. Instead, he found himself confronting evidence of supernatural phenomena so compelling that it would fundamentally change his understanding of reality and prompt him to seek religious counsel for the first time in his adult life. Captain Austin's police report, filed as case number 12C01136, provides one of the most detailed law enforcement documentations of supernatural activity on record. The report describes Austin's direct observation of Andre walking backward up a wall and across the ceiling of the hospital room, moving with fluid motion that appeared completely natural despite being physically impossible. Austin noted in his report that Andre maintained normal conversation throughout the event, apparently unaware that his actions were extraordinary. The officer's military background and police training had taught him to observe details carefully and report them accurately, making his documentation particularly credible to other law enforcement agencies. The police investigation expanded to include the Carolina Street house, where Austin and other officers documented additional supernatural phenomena that corroborated the family's claims. Temperature readings throughout the house revealed inexplicable cold spots that moved from room to room without any apparent source. Electronic equipment malfunctioned consistently within the house, with cameras, recording devices, and communication equipment failing in ways that technicians could not explain. Most disturbing to the investigating officers were the voices they recorded coming from empty rooms, including what appeared to be children's laughter from the basement when no children were present in the house. The culmination of the official investigation came when the Indiana Department of Child Services made the unprecedented decision to remove the children from the home, based not on evidence of abuse, but on their determination that the supernatural activity posed a genuine threat to the children's safety and well-being. This decision represented the first time in Indiana history that children were placed in protective custody due to paranormal activity, setting a legal precedent that recognized supernatural phenomena as a legitimate child welfare concern. The children's placement in foster care initially reduced the intensity of supernatural manifestations, supporting theories that the entities were specifically targeting the Ammons family rather than being tied to the Carolina Street location. However, The foster families who took the children reported continued supernatural activity, though less severe than what had been documented in the original home. Social workers noted that all three children continued to demonstrate knowledge and abilities that could not be explained through conventional means, including Andre's occasional episodes of walking on walls and ceilings. The case attracted national media attention when police reports and medical records were leaked to journalists, creating a firestorm of controversy about the role of supernatural beliefs in official government decision-making. Skeptics argued that the officials involved had been victims of mass hysteria or had fabricated their reports to cover up more conventional explanations for the children's behavior. However, the consistency of reports from multiple independent sources, including law enforcement, medical professionals, and social workers, made wholesale fabrication extremely unlikely. The resolution of the Ammons case came through an extensive exorcism performed by Father Michael Maginot, a Catholic priest who had experience with paranormal investigations and demonic possession cases. Father Maginot's involvement provided the religious framework necessary to address the supernatural phenomena that secular authorities had been unable to handle. The exorcism process took several months and involved multiple ceremonies designed to break the demonic attachments that had formed around the family members. The success of the religious intervention was documented through the gradual cessation of supernatural phenomena and the children's return to normal behavior patterns. Medical follow-up examinations showed no residual effects from their experiences, and psychological evaluations indicated that all three children had returned to age-appropriate development levels. The family was eventually reunited and relocated to a different house, where they reported no recurrence of supernatural activity. The Ammons case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of demonic possession in modern American history, with corroborating evidence from medical professionals, law enforcement officers, social workers, and religious authorities. The consistency of witness testimonies, combined with physical evidence, including audio recordings, temperature readings, and medical documentation, creates a compelling case for genuine supernatural phenomena that cannot be easily dismissed as fraud or delusion. The broader implications of the case extend beyond questions of supernatural reality to fundamental issues about the intersection of religious belief, government authority, and child welfare. The decision to remove children from their home based on paranormal activity raised constitutional questions about the separation of church and state, while also establishing precedents for how child protective services might handle similar cases in the future. For the residents of Gary, Indiana, the Ammons case served as a reminder that horror can emerge in the most ordinary settings, transforming a typical family home into a battleground between good and evil. The house at 3860 Carolina Street has since been demolished, but the memory of what occurred there continues to influence how the community understands the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. In a city that has faced decades of economic decline and social problems, the Ammons haunting proved that some challenges require solutions that exist far beyond the realm of conventional public policy or social services. The legacy of the Carolina Street House serves as a testament to the power of evil to invade ordinary lives and the importance of faith-based responses to threats that cannot be addressed through secular means. Whether one believes in demonic possession or not, the Ammons case provides compelling evidence that reality contains dimensions that modern science and law enforcement are not equipped to understand or address, leaving families vulnerable to forces that operate according to rules that exist outside human comprehension. Let's move to our 11th story. Redwood Valley, California. Population 1,729. A small community nestled among towering redwood trees in Northern California, where the natural beauty masked a horror so profound that it would eventually shock the world. Between 1965 and 1977, this peaceful valley became the training ground for the most devastating act of mass murder-suicide in modern history. Long before the tragedy of Jonestown claimed 918 lives in the jungles of Guyana, Jim Jones was perfecting his techniques of psychological manipulation, mind control, and mass murder right here in America, using the residents of Redwood Valley as unwitting test subjects in his rehearsals for Apocalypse. The People's Temple Agricultural Project, as Jones officially called his Redwood Valley compound, appeared to be everything a progressive religious community should be. The organization promoted racial integration, social justice, and communal living at a time when such ideals were revolutionary in rural California. Jones preached a message of apostolic socialism that attracted educated, idealistic followers who genuinely believed they were building a better world. What these devoted members didn't realize was that they had joined a carefully constructed psychological experiment designed to test the limits of human obedience and the effectiveness of terror as a tool of control. Jim Jones had chosen Redwood Valley specifically for its isolation and the community's liberal political climate, which would be more accepting of his integrated congregation and socialist message. The 917-acre compound was surrounded by dense forest that provided natural barriers against outside observation and interference. Jones used this isolation to create a closed society where he could implement increasingly extreme forms of psychological control without attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement or concerned relatives. The compound became a laboratory where Jones could refine the techniques he would later use to murder nearly 1,000 people in Jonestown. The transformation of Jones's followers from idealistic believers into willing participants in mass murder didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of systematic psychological conditioning that began immediately upon their arrival in Redwood Valley. New members were subjected to sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and constant surveillance that broke down their psychological defenses and made them dependent on Jones for basic survival needs. Families were deliberately separated, with children placed in communal dormitories where they could be indoctrinated without parental interference. The most sinister aspect of the Redwood Valley operation was Jones's development of what he called white nights, emergency drills that served as rehearsals for mass suicide. During these exercises, Jones would wake the entire community in the middle of the night with sirens and loudspeakers, claiming that the compound was under attack by government forces or hostile outsiders. Members were forced to gather in the central pavilion, where Jones would distribute what he claimed was poison-laced fruit punch and command everyone to drink it immediately to avoid torture and death at the hands of their enemies. The early White Night rehearsals were presented as loyalty tests designed to demonstrate members' commitment to the cause and their willingness to die rather than betray the community. Jones would wait until everyone had consumed the supposed poison before revealing that it was actually harmless flavored drink, praising the congregation for their faithfulness and dedication. These exercises served multiple psychological purposes. They desensitized members to the concept of mass suicide, established Jones's absolute authority over life and death decisions, and identified potential resistors who could be isolated and subjected to additional conditioning. As the White Night drills became more frequent and elaborate, Jones began incorporating increasingly realistic elements designed to make the threat of outside attack seem credible. Armed guards would fire weapons into the air to simulate gunfire, while other members would scream and act as if they were being pursued by hostile forces. Jones would provide detailed narratives about government agents, rival religious groups, or racist vigilantes who were supposedly converging on the compound to murder everyone. The psychological impact of these manufactured crises was devastating, creating a constant state of fear and paranoia that made members completely dependent on Jones for protection and guidance. The most horrifying aspect of the White Night rehearsals was Jones's systematic conditioning of children to accept death as preferable to capture. Children as young as 6 years old were taught to view poison as revolutionary suicide that would transport them to a better existence while denying their enemies the satisfaction of torturing them. Jones would hold special training sessions where children practiced drinking bitter liquids without complaint, teaching them that true devotion required unquestioning obedience, even unto death. Former members later testified that children who refused to participate in these exercises were subjected to physical punishment and psychological torture that continued until they complied. The compound's medical facilities played a crucial role in Jones's preparation for mass murder, serving as both a laboratory for developing effective poison delivery methods and a training ground for medical personnel who would later assist in the Jonestown killings. Dr. Lawrence Schacht, a young physician who had joined the temple while still in medical school, conducted extensive research on various toxins and their effects on human physiology. Under Jones's direction, Schacht experimented with different combinations of cyanide, sedatives, and flavoring agents to develop a mixture that would be fast-acting, difficult to detect, and palatable enough that victims would consume lethal doses before realizing they had been poisoned. The medical experiments extended beyond poison development to include testing various methods of mass distribution and studying the psychological factors that would encourage compliance during actual implementation. Jones was particularly interested in understanding how to overcome the natural human survival instinct. Conducting psychological studies on members' reactions to simulated death scenarios. These experiments revealed that peer pressure, authority figures, and the presence of children were the most effective tools for ensuring mass compliance with suicide orders. Perhaps most chilling was Jones's systematic identification and elimination of potential resistors within the community. Members who showed signs of independent thinking, questioned authority, or expressed reluctance during white night exercises were subjected to increasingly severe forms of punishment and psychological manipulation. Some were forced to participate in public confession sessions where they had to admit to imaginary crimes and pledge renewed loyalty to Jones. Others were subjected to sensory deprivation, forced labor, or sexual humiliation designed to break their will to resist. The most extreme cases involved what Jones euphemistically called healing sessions, which were actually sophisticated torture procedures designed to eliminate dissent and demonstrate the consequences of defiance. Members who had attempted to leave the compound or contact outside authorities were brought before the entire community and subjected to physical and psychological abuse that served as object lessons for other potential dissidents. These sessions were carefully choreographed to maximize their psychological impact, with Jones presenting the punishment as necessary medical treatment for the victim's mental illness or demonic possession. The transition from psychological manipulation to actual murder began in 1976, when Jones started conducting what he called final white nights with genuine poison rather than harmless beverages. These early killings were presented as mercy killings of elderly or sick members who had volunteered to sacrifice themselves for the good of the community. Jones would select victims who were isolated from their families, suffering from serious illnesses, or showing signs of potential disloyalty. The murders were conducted in private ceremonies with only trusted inner circle members present, and the deaths were attributed to natural causes or medical complications. Former members who escaped before the final tragedy later testified about discovering bodies buried throughout the Redwood Valley compound. Evidence of Jones's practice killings that prepared him and his inner circle for the mass murder they would later commit in Guyana. These early victims were primarily elderly members who had donated their life savings to the temple, making them financially expendable once their assets had been transferred to Jones's control. The systematic murder of these vulnerable individuals served as training exercises for the medical and security personnel who would later administer poison to hundreds of victims in Jonestown. The psychological conditioning process reached its final stage in 1977, when Jones announced that the community would be relocating to a new settlement in the South American nation of Guyana. The move was presented as an escape from persecution and an opportunity to build a truly socialist paradise. But former members later revealed that Jones had described it privately as the location where the community would make its final stand against a hostile world. The selection of Guyana was strategic. Its remote location and limited communication infrastructure would make escape virtually impossible, while providing the isolation necessary for Jones to implement his ultimate plan. The departure from Redwood Valley was carefully orchestrated to separate members from any remaining connections to the outside world. Families were split up during the relocation process, with some members sent to Guyana while others remained in California to continue fundraising and recruitment activities. This separation served multiple purposes. It prevented coordinated resistance, provided Jones with hostages to ensure compliance from those who might have second thoughts, and maintained the appearance of voluntary participation in the relocation program. The techniques Jones perfected in Redwood Valley, psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, social isolation, manufactured crises, and systematic elimination of resistance, would prove devastatingly effective when implemented on a larger scale in Jonestown. The White Night rehearsals that had begun as loyalty tests in the California compound ultimately culminated in the murder of 918 people, including 304 children, in the jungles of Guyana on November 18, 1978. The victims died believing they were making a revolutionary statement against oppression, never realizing they had been systematically conditioned to participate in their own murder. The legacy of Redwood Valley serves as a chilling reminder of how easily idealistic communities can be transformed into instruments of mass destruction when charismatic leaders are allowed to operate without oversight or accountability. The techniques Jones developed in his California compound have been studied by psychologists and cult experts as examples of how systematic manipulation can overcome fundamental human survival instincts. The case provides crucial insights into the warning signs of dangerous cult activity and the importance of maintaining connections between vulnerable individuals and the outside world. The compound buildings have long since been demolished, but the psychological scars left on survivors and their families continue to influence how experts understand the dynamics of cult manipulation and mass murder. Former members who escaped before the final tragedy have dedicated their lives to educating others about the warning signs of dangerous group dynamics and the gradual process by which normal people can be transformed into willing participants in atrocities. For the residents of Redwood Valley, who witnessed the People's Temple's presence in their community, the knowledge that mass murder was being rehearsed in their midst creates lasting questions about collective responsibility and the importance of intervention when isolated communities begin exhibiting signs of dangerous extremism. The case stands as testimony to the fact that the most horrific crimes in human history often begin with seemingly noble intentions and gradual escalations that normalize increasingly extreme behavior. The horror of Redwood Valley wasn't just that it produced one of history's most devastating acts of mass murder. It was that an entire community participated in rehearsing their own destruction while believing they were working toward salvation. In the redwood forests of Northern California, evil perfected its technique through practice, patience, and the exploitation of humanity's most admirable qualities: faith, loyalty, and the desire to build a better world. The tragedy serves as an eternal warning that the path to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, and that the most dangerous monsters are often those who convince us they are leading us toward paradise. If these 11 stories of small-town horror have shown you anything, it's that evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic music or obvious warning signs. It hides behind friendly faces, respected positions, and familiar institutions. The most terrifying truth is that any community, no matter how safe, how close-knit, or how peaceful, can become the hunting ground for monsters who understand that our trust in each other is both our greatest strength and our most vulnerable weakness. Share this video with someone you care about, because in a world where horror hides in plain sight, awareness is our only defense. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because verified fears will continue exposing the dark truths that others are afraid to tell. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember, the next small-town horror story could be happening right next door.